In the oldest stories ever etched into clay, before kings ruled cities and before humans believed themselves to be the first thinkers on this earth, there was a time the Sumerians remembered with startling clarity, a world they insisted existed long before their own. It was a world they said was shared, not inhabited solely by humans, but by other intelligent beings who walked beside them, taught them, ruled them, and then vanished so completely that only fragments of memory survived. These memories were pressed into tablets, carved into stone, encoded in myths that later civilizations reduced to metaphors. Yet to the Sumerians, they were not metaphors at all, they were history. And in the ruins of their cities, beneath layers of flood-deposited clay and sand, carried by 5,000 years of desert wind, the echoes of that older world still wait to be read. Imagine standing in southern Iraq at dusk, the sky turning copper over a horizon that has not meaningfully changed since the first temples rose from the floodplains. The air is thick with dust, and the remains of ancient cities stretch across the land like bones exposed by time. Beneath your feet lie buried thousands of tablets, each one a small window into a world both familiar and impossibly strange. The Sumerians wrote of kings who reigned for centuries, of sages who emerged from the sea each dawn, of beings with wings, scales, talons, or radiant skin who served as teachers and guardians. They separated these beings from humans with a determinative sign, marking them as real and distinct, not poetic inventions. They drew them consistently, precisely, without evolution in form, across 2,000 years of art. And they insisted that before the flood, these were the ones who guided humanity. When you walk through a modern museum and see these artifacts under glass, it's easy to interpret them as symbolic imaginings. But the Sumerians depicted them with anatomical accuracy, as though recording observation, not imagination. Wing joints carved where they should be on a functional wing. Musculature aligned exactly as it must be for movement. Scales arranged following natural reptilian patterning. Faces proportioned like people, yet distinctly not human. These carvings appear not only in temples, but also on administrative seals, boundary markers, and property documents. They appear where religious fancy is least expected, woven into everyday life. What kind of memory is so strong it permeates bureaucracy? The question becomes heavier when you consider that the Sumerians did not portray these beings as purely divine abstractions. They wrote about their cities, their dwellings, their specific duties. They described them performing tasks humans could not do, holding tools humans did not hold, participating in cosmic assemblies that humans only witnessed from a distance. They placed them in the deep past, before the flood, when kingship descended from heaven and civilization was measured in spans too long for human life. After the flood, these beings vanish abruptly from the record. The king list acknowledges their disappearance openly. Before the flood, kings ruled extraordinary lengths of time. After the flood, human kings rule for lifespans we recognize. What happened between those two eras? The flood, the Sumerians said, was not a story. It was an event, a dividing line that separated the age of many intelligent beings from the age of one. And the archaeological record agrees that something catastrophic occurred. Across multiple Sumerian cities, flood layers appear thick and sudden, sealing older worlds beneath meters of sediment. Above these layers, civilization restarts with familiar architecture, writing, mathematics. But deeper beneath, in the earlier layers, remnants of different building patterns, unusual foundations, and inexplicable tools appear, as though belonging to a culture with knowledge inconsistent with its supposed time. This raises the unsettling possibility that the Sumerians were not describing distant myth, but recalling a real inheritance from a world destroyed long before their own. A world where humans were not the sole architects of civilization, but the successors of beings who lived and vanished long before our species claimed the Earth. If these beings truly existed, if the Sumerians were preserving accurate memory rather than imagination, then the story of humanity is far older and far stranger than we assume. So we begin where all Sumerian memory begins, at the threshold between the world before the flood and the world after, standing at the edge of ruins shaped by hands long turned to dust. The Sumerians claimed they remembered what came before. The tablets claim they recorded it so we would one day ask the same question they asked as they rebuilt their world. If we are not the first, then who came before us, and why did they disappear? The answer lies deep in the layers we are about to explore, where myth, archaeology, and forbidden memory converge. But as always with Sumerian history, what comes next will change everything. If you lift one of those ancient tablets from the soil of southern Iraq, letting the dust fall away from the wedge-shaped marks, you feel something strange beneath your fingertips. The script does not look experimental or primitive. It looks practiced, deliberate, the work of a civilization already comfortable with record-keeping, mathematics, and astronomy. Scholars first encountering these tablets in the 1800s were shocked by the suddenness of Sumer's intellectual birth. There is no progression from simple drawings to complex script. Cuneiform appears fully formed, as if borrowed from somewhere else or inherited from someone else. The Sumerians never claimed to invent writing. In their own stories, they learned it. It was given to them by beings they called the ones who measured, the ones who descended, the ones who rose from the deep. And this raises a disturbing question. What if cuneiform is not the first writing system on Earth, but simply the first one created by humans? In the ruins of Eridu, Sumer's oldest city according to their king list, archaeologists uncovered 17 layers of temples stacked like geological time capsules. The deeper the excavators dug, the stranger the structures became. In the lowest layers, reaching back to around 5400 BC, they found buildings that did not match later Sumerian architectural practice at all. The brick proportions were standardized. The walls oriented perfectly to cardinal directions, and certain foundation materials suggested knowledge beyond what early farming villages should have possessed. Yet these earliest structures were already temples, places of worship for gods the Sumerians insisted were present before humans built anything. If the Sumerians constructed these earliest temples, why do they appear with no developmental stages, as if their architects were already trained? And if the Sumerians did not build them, who did? Consider the story the Sumerians told repeatedly across thousands of tablets. At the beginning of their world, long before human kings, beings known as the Apkallu emerged from the freshwater abyss to teach humanity how to build, how to irrigate, how to write, how to measure the heavens. They were depicted as part fish, part human, or as bird-headed figures with muscular, human-like bodies. Their images are consistent across 2,000 years of Mesopotamian art, not stylized gods, not symbolic metaphors, but beings whose anatomy is rendered with startling accuracy. If you place two relief carvings of Apkallu from different centuries side by side, the proportions are the same. Wing attachment points, muscle contours, scale patterning, even the posture remains unchanged. Artistic conventions evolve, but memory does not, and these images behave like memory. When the early archaeologists unearthed these hybrid beings carved into palace walls and temple foundations, they were quick to categorize them as mythological creatures, no more real than dragons or griffins. But the Sumerians did not categorize them that way. They used a linguistic determinative, dingir, to mark these beings as real entities, as physical presences, not abstract symbols. They worshipped their gods, yet described these other beings differently. The Apkallu walked among humans. They held tools, they taught skills, they performed rituals, and the Sumerians placed them in administrative contexts, like boundary stones and legal seals, where purely symbolic figures rarely appear. Why would bureaucratic documents include beings that never existed? Cylinder seals complicate the mystery further. These small stone cylinders, used to identify ownership or authority, depict scenes that combine human figures with towering non-human beings who oversee construction, bless agricultural fields, or hand tablets to scribes. The proportions are consistent. The non-human figures stand significantly taller than humans, often by precise ratios. The consistency across seals suggests these depictions were not imagined freely, but followed an established template, one the Sumerians believed reflected reality. In several seals, bird-headed beings hold measuring rods and ropes, the tools archaeologists associate with surveying, astronomy, and temple alignment. Why would mythological beings use technical instruments? When you look at these images long enough, another unsettling pattern emerges. The Sumerians did not depict themselves learning these skills gradually. They depicted themselves receiving them suddenly. Agriculture, architecture, metallurgy, mathematics, all appear in the archaeological record of Sumer with remarkable rapidity. One moment, small villages. The next, planned cities with right-angled streets, irrigation systems stretching for miles, and temples aligned with solstice positions. And through their own stories, the Sumerians explained this leap as the result of instruction. They were taught, they said, by beings older than humans. Not spiritual guides, but physical presences whose forms were carved into stone again and again with anatomical consistency. This pattern also appears in their king list, perhaps the most provocative document from ancient Mesopotamia. It begins with rulers whose reigns span tens of thousands of years, durations no human could survive. Yet the list presents them with the same formulaic precision used for later, historically attested kings. The Sumerians did not distinguish myth from history the way later cultures did. They treated their earliest rulers as literal. The list divides the past into two eras, before the flood and after. Before the flood, kings were not human, or at least not fully human. Their names are marked with the determinative reserved for divine or non-human beings. Their reigns are impossibly long. Their cities appear older in archaeological layers than human settlement should allow. After the flood, human kings rule for human-length lives. Archaeological evidence aligns ironically well with this structure. Across multiple Sumerian sites, a thick flood layer separates earlier, anomalous settlements from later, clearly human ones. Whatever existed before this flood appears to have vanished nearly completely, leaving behind only strange foundations, unexplained artifacts, and cultural memories reinterpreted as mythology. The flood, according to Sumerian sources, was not just a disaster. It was an extinction, a cleansing of the world that ended one set of beings and allowed another to rise. If this sounds fantastical, consider that the Sumerians did not write their earliest tablets to entertain. They wrote to record. They were obsessed with preservation. Their entire culture revolved around keeping knowledge intact. If their ancestors had truly lived alongside other intelligent beings, whether amphibious sages, radiant rulers, or winged guardians, they would have recorded that history exactly as they experienced it. And the tablets do exactly that. So as we move forward into the deeper layers of this narrative, into the oldest myths, the earliest architectural anomalies, and the astronomical knowledge attributed to the ones who measured before us, the question grows sharper. What if the Sumerians were not describing fantasy, but memory? What if humanity inherited civilization instead of inventing it? What if we were not the first to walk this earth with intelligence, but simply the last? The answers lie ahead, in tablets that survived fire, flood, conquest, and time itself. Tablets that whisper a story too large for history as we know it. And as we descend further, we follow the Sumerians into the past they insisted was real, a past where humans were not alone. To understand the world the Sumerians believed existed before humanity, we must begin with the beings they said shaped it. These beings appear in every category of Sumerian text: creation myths, royal inscriptions, star catalogs, ritual instructions, temple hymns, and even administrative tablets. Their presence is not marginal, it is foundational, and the Sumerians never describe them as allegory, they describe them as fact. The most striking group among these ancient beings are the Apkallu, the seven sages, figures so important that the Sumerians claimed no temple, no city, no king could function without the knowledge these beings delivered. According to the texts, the Apkallu emerged one by one during the reigns of the earliest rulers, the antediluvian kings whose reigns lasted thousands of years. The Apkallu brought the me, a word scholars translate as the divine laws, but which the Sumerians understood as something closer to the encoded principles of civilization. These weren't commandments carved by a deity, they were blueprints, rules of mathematics, architecture, agriculture, and ritual science, and the Apkallu delivered them physically as teachers. Berossus, the Babylonian priest writing in the 3rd century BC from much older Sumerian records, described the first Apkallu, Oans, in astonishing detail. His body was that of a fish, the scales covering him like armor, but beneath the fish head was another head, distinctly human, and beneath the fish tail were human legs. Oans spent his days among humans, never eating, never sleeping, teaching relentlessly, and returning to the sea at night. This description, written thousands of years after the earliest Sumerian tablets, matches perfectly the images carved into cylinder seals nearly 3,000 years older. The consistency here isn't mythic drift, it's preserved identity, but Oans was only the first. 6 more Apkallu followed, each tied to a specific city and a specific domain of knowledge. One taught metallurgy, another agriculture, another astronomy, another the construction of temples aligned to the heavens. Each appears in both textual and artistic records, their names preserved in clay just as one might preserve historical advisors or scholars. These were not imagined figures. They were documented instructors. The Sumerians were so devoted to preserving accurate memory that they placed small figurines of fish-bodied humans beneath temple foundations, literal miniature Apkallu, meant to protect sacred structures by invoking the presence of those ancient teachers. In many cases, these figurines were buried where no human would ever see them again. They were not symbols for worship. They were marks of continuity, reminders that the knowledge used to build each temple came from beings who existed long before the Sumerians themselves. The Apkallu are only one category of non-human beings. Another group, the Anunnaki, appear as radiant, towering figures with luminous skin and elongated skulls. The Sumerians called them the princely seed, the shining ones, and those who decree the fates. Unlike the Apkallu, teachers from the deep, the Anunnaki were said to come from the sky, descending to earth in ancient times to govern and maintain order. Their descriptions combine biological specificity with otherworldly attributes. They eat, they drink, they dwell in palaces, they bleed, but they also shine, radiate, and live far longer than normal beings. Text after text repeats that the Anunnaki walked among humans before the flood, ruling cities and instructing early kings. But after the flood, their physical presence dwindles. They become remote, inaccessible, leaving behind only rituals, priesthoods, and architectural instructions. It is as though the flood erased not just cities, but an entire category of beings who once inhabited the world. The Sumerians also consistently describe beings with bird heads and wings, creatures later identified by Assyriologists as a type of Apkallu as well. These bird-headed figures appear in palace reliefs and cylinder seals, standing twice the height of humans, holding pine cones and buckets used in purification rituals. They are shown planting seeds, blessing kings, and measuring temple grounds. Their wings are rendered with anatomical fidelity, primary and secondary feathers distinguished, musculature accurate for flight. These are not costumes. They are bodies. The same goes for the reptilian humanoids carved into boundary stones from the Kassite period and depicted in earlier Sumerian art. Their scale patterns follow biological rules, smaller around joints, larger across the torso. Their skulls are elongated, their eye placement slightly more lateral than human biology would allow. Yet their posture is upright, their hands dexterous, their clothing sometimes ornate. These beings are shown interacting with humans in contexts that imply instruction, authority, or guardianship. Why would artists carve such precise anatomical detail for beings that never existed? Why would mythological figures appear in documents regulating property boundaries, temple offerings, or royal decrees? The closer we look, the more the Sumerian world divides into two eras, before the flood and after. Before the flood, hybrid beings teach humans. Gods walk among cities. Sages rise from the sea. Kings live for millennia. After the flood, humans rebuild with remnants of inherited knowledge, kings live normal lifespans, and the extraordinary beings vanish from everyday life. But the Sumerians insisted the beings themselves did not begin as myths. They were remembered as realities, and this is where the archaeological record becomes most problematic. Beneath the flood layers at several ancient cities, Eridu, Shuruppak, Kish, excavators found artifacts that don't match the human cultures above them. Stone foundations cut with tools that should not exist yet. Pottery styles that match no known pre-Sumerian groups. Symbolic carvings that resemble early writing, but are older than cuneiform by over 1,000 years. Even obsidian tools suggesting long-distance trade networks predating known settlements. If this were a single site, it might be dismissed as anomaly, but the pattern repeats across multiple locations. Something existed in Mesopotamia before the Sumerians. Something with architecture, tools, perhaps even symbolic communication. Yet that something left almost no trace. No bodies, no continuous culture, no gradual evolution into Sumerian civilization. Instead, the Sumerians appear suddenly with advanced knowledge, and they attribute all of it to beings who existed before the flood. This is the uncomfortable tension at the core of Sumerian origins. Either the Sumerians fabricated a vast, consistent mythos describing non-human species with extraordinary knowledge, or they were recording a memory of something real, something older than us, something erased. And so we stand at the edge of the question that Sumerian tablets quietly whisper, what vanished during the flood? What walked the earth before humans claimed it? And why did the Sumerians believe so strongly that we were not the first? In the next block, we explore the engineering and architecture the Sumerians claimed they inherited, not invented, and the evidence buried beneath their cities that suggests someone else was building long before them. If the Sumerians inherited their knowledge, then architecture is the clearest fingerprint of what came before. Because unlike myth, unlike stories, unlike lineages that can blur over centuries, buildings do not lie. Foundations do not exaggerate. Walls do not drift into poetic metaphor. Stone preserves intention. Brick preserves hands. And the deepest layers of Sumer's oldest cities tell a story radically different from the one found in textbooks. To begin, we must go to Eridu, the first city, according to the Sumerians themselves. The king list opens with a phrase scholars have never fully explained. When kingship descended from heaven, kingship was in Eridu, a kingdom placed, not developed, something given, not invented. The earliest levels at Eridu are older than Sumerian civilization by nearly 2,000 years, and the deeper archaeologists dig, the stranger the structures become. In the 1940s and 1950s, Iraqi and British excavation teams uncovered 17 architectural phases stacked like geological layers. The uppermost levels look like expected early temples, mud brick, rectangular layouts, altars, offering pits. But then the layers descend into something that should not exist. Temples whose proportions follow geometric ratios still used in later Sumerian architecture. Ratios they were supposedly inventing, not inheriting. The lowest levels, Temple 6 through Temple 1, sit directly atop virgin soil, untouched by prior settlement. Yet those earliest temples show orientation toward the cardinal directions, standardized brick sizes and symmetrical plans that imply not experimentation, but mastery. It is as if the very first builders at Eridu knew the entire architectural language of Sumer before Sumer existed. Even more unsettling were the foundation deposits. Beneath several early temples, excavators discovered miniature figurines, fish-bodied sages, bird-headed beings, hybrid figures intentionally buried during construction. These were placed where no living worshiper would ever see them again. They were not for human eyes, they were for continuity, a message to the future. This temple is built according to ancient plans. The Sumerian texts confirm this. Multiple inscriptions from later kings say they rebuilt temples according to the original measurements, or following the plan from before the flood, not inspired by mythic memory. Specific measurements, specific proportions, specific orientations, as if blueprints had been handed down from a civilization erased. Uruk tells a similar story. Beneath the White Temple, an architectural marvel dated to around 3200 BC, lie massive limestone blocks that should not be there. Limestone doesn't occur naturally in the region. It had to be transported over 60 miles from distant quarries. But these stones are cut with such precision that they fit almost seamlessly, using techniques unknown in the archaeological record of the time. The German team documenting the discovery in the 1930s wrote, "The precision suggests experience, yet these are the oldest structural elements we have found." Experience. From where? Stone tools found beneath these layers show marks inconsistent with copper and bronze implements. Some appear to have been shaped using heat treatments requiring temperatures far above what 4th millennium kilns could achieve. A few fragments appear vitrified, partially melted, as if exposed to intense heat in a controlled environment. What technology was available 5,400 years ago to melt stone? Then there is Kish. Beneath its flood layer, dated roughly to 2900 BC, archaeologists found tools that predate Sumerian civilization by nearly 4,000 years. Obsidian blades, flint scrapers, pottery fired using techniques that match no known culture, and most baffling of all, a limestone block carved with symbols resembling proto-cuneiform, yet older than writing itself by over a millennium. Whoever carved them lived in an era supposedly devoid of complex symbolic communication, yet the tool marks show confidence, not experimentation. If these were merely isolated anomalies, scholars could dismiss them as misdated artifacts or intrusive layers. But the pattern repeats across site after site. Beneath the flood deposits lie older foundations. Beneath early Sumerian temples lie footprints of vanished builders. Beneath documented cities lie cities we cannot name. The Sumerians themselves never claimed to be inventors. They described themselves as heirs. Their texts are consistent. Kingship existed before humans. Measurement existed before humans. Astronomy existed before humans. Architecture existed before humans. What then existed before humans? The Sumerian answer is unambiguous. The Apkallu built the first temples. The Anunnaki designed the cosmic order. The Igigi labored before humans were formed. And all of these beings vanished in the flood or left. Is it possible that humans simply moved into abandoned cities? That they found ruins left by older populations? It is not only possible, it is implied by Sumerian writings. One inscription reads, "We restored the temple on the foundation laid in ancient times before the waters." Another, "We built according to the plan written in the days of the sages." Another, "We found the measurement stones of the ancients buried deep in the earth." These phrases describe archaeology, not mythology. Discovery, excavation, invocation of preserved knowledge. But if humans rebuilt on the ruins of earlier civilizations, where are those earlier civilizations now? Why do their remains not resemble human remains? Why do their depicted forms, fish-bodied, bird-headed, radiant-skinned, have no fossil record? Why do they vanish precisely where the flood deposits begin? One explanation is extinction, the flood wiping out populations already small. But another possibility is hinted at in later Babylonian and Assyrian texts. Those earlier beings returned to their places, or withdrew to the heavens, or went back to the deep. Departure, not death. Retreat, not annihilation. And yet another possibility, uncomfortable but entirely consistent with the texts, is assimilation, interbreeding, hybridization. Humanity formed from the mixture of earth and divine blood may reflect not metaphor, but memory, a merging of lineages, a dilution of earlier species into a growing human population until only faint biological echoes remained. The deeper we go, the more the lines blur between archaeology and mythology, between record and remembrance. Beneath the cities lie earlier cities. Beneath human kings lie pre-human rulers. Beneath Sumerian architecture lie structures whose builders cannot be named. And through every layer runs the same whisper: we inherited a world built by others. In the next block, we explore the knowledge the Sumerians believed they inherited from those others, knowledge of the heavens, the mathematics of time, and the astronomical records that appear too advanced for a civilization just beginning to write. If architecture is the fingerprint of forgotten builders, then astronomy is their signature, etched not into brick or stone, but into the sky itself. Because while buildings can crumble, celestial patterns endure, and the Sumerians claimed not to have discovered the motions of the heavens, but to have inherited them from beings who measured the stars long before humans existed. To understand the magnitude of this claim, we must look at the first true star catalog in history, the Emule.apin. Compiled around 1000 BC, it is universally acknowledged to be a copy of much older material that already contained accurate records of planetary cycles, constellations, heliacal risings, eclipse intervals, and mathematical methods for predicting future celestial events. But the most unsettling feature of Mole-Apin is not its content. It is its lack of development. These tablets do not show a science in its infancy. They show a science already mature, already precise, already built on centuries, perhaps millennia, of uninterrupted observation. Yet Sumerian civilization, as traditionally dated, had barely begun when such knowledge first appears in the record. The tablet lists the rising and setting times of 66 stars and constellations, the exact length of the solar year, the 8-year cycle of Venus, the synodic periods of Jupiter, Saturn, and Mars, the formula for predicting lunar eclipses, the division of the sky into 3 celestial paths. Modern astronomers studied these records and were stunned. The Venus cycle data is accurate to within a single day over periods of multiple years. That level of precision requires multi-generational observations spanning at least a century, and more realistically, several centuries. But the Sumerians themselves never claimed to have produced such long-term observations. Instead, the texts say the measurements were established before the flood by those who came before us. The phrase recurs across tablets. The watchers of old measured the paths. The stars were ordered in ancient days. The calculations of the ancients are preserved. The most literal translation appears in a fragment. These are the measurements of heaven which the sages wrote down in the time before the waters. This is the language of archival preservation, not invention. And the most significant clue lies in the system the Sumerians used to encode this knowledge: base 60 mathematics. Across human history, nearly every number system emerges organically from the human body. 10 fingers, 10 digits, base 10 or base 20, base 60, does not. It is not intuitive. It is not anthropological. It is not even convenient, unless you are doing astronomy. 60 is divisible by nearly everything needed for celestial calculations. It is the perfect system for mapping orbital periods and dividing circles. Yet the Sumerians did not experiment their way into it. There are no earlier number systems, no transitional phases, no simpler prototypes. Base 60 appears fully formed in the earliest tablets, as if imported from somewhere else. The Sumerians explain this with a single statement found in temple hymns. The numbers of heaven were given to us. One Akkadian commentary text elaborates, the measures of time were established before the reign of kings by those who knew the movements, those who knew, not humans, not scribes, not priests. The watchers, the 7 sages, the ones who measured the heavens. Iconography reinforces the claim. Cylinder seals show winged or bird-headed beings holding surveying rods, fish-bodied sages carrying measuring ropes, hybrid figures pointing instruments toward star symbols. These scenes are not symbolic. They depict measurement, geometry, observation. But the greatest mathematical mystery, the one even mainstream scholars whisper about, concerns precession, the slow wobble of Earth's axis that shifts the position of stars over a 26,000-year cycle. Precession is almost impossible to detect within a single lifetime. Ancient Greek astronomers are credited with its discovery around 150 BC. Yet Sumerian myths describe long ages ruled by different constellations, shifting in the exact direction and order precession predicts. The Epic of Gilgamesh speaks of 12 cosmic eras, each marked by a different heavenly guardian, each lasting long years beyond counting. The motions described correspond exactly to the precessional movement through the zodiac, something a civilization only a few centuries old could not have observed, unless they had records far older than their civilization, unless those records were inherited. One tablet from Ashurbanipal's library states plainly, "The wisdom of the heavens is the secret of the gods, which the sages brought up from the Abzu before the flood destroyed their dwellings." This sentence contains 3 extraordinary claims. 1. The knowledge did not originate with humans. 2. It was brought up from the deep, the Abzu, the primordial waters. 3. It was saved from destruction by beings who already possessed it. It is the Sumerian equivalent of saying, we did not invent astronomy, we preserved it. Even temple alignments corroborate this inheritance. Across Sumerian cities, Eridu's earliest temple aligns precisely with the winter solstice dawn. Uruk's ziggurat aligns with solstice sunsets. Nippur's religious center aligns with the lunar standstill cycle. These alignments are accurate within 1 degree, precision difficult even today without advanced instruments. And the earliest temples show the same precision as the later ones. There is no learning curve. To align a temple to the solstice, you need a stable observation point for several years, knowledge of horizon shifts, calculations compensating for atmospheric distortion. But the earliest Sumerian builders did not display trial and error. They displayed mastery. And again, the Sumerian explanation is consistent. We built according to the measurements they taught us. Who were they? The Sumerian texts answer without hesitation. The Apkallu, the 7 sages, half fish, half human beings. The Igigi, the watchers in the sky. The Anunnaki, those descended from the heavens. Modern scholars interpret these beings symbolically, but the Sumerians did not. They depicted these beings anatomically, consistently, and with technical correctness across 2,000 years of artwork. If all of this is taken at face value, one implication remains. The Sumerians were not the first astronomers. They were the heirs of astronomers who came long before them. In the next block, we follow this thread deeper. The disappearance of these beings, the flood narratives that mark their final era, and the abrupt transformation of the world that followed. If astronomy was the inherited science of the ancient world, then the flood was the inherited trauma, the dividing line between species, eras, and realities. Every Sumerian text that mentions the early world uses the same structure, before the flood and after the flood, not as mythic metaphor, but as geological fact. as if the world that existed before the catastrophe was so different, so populated by beings now gone, that only the flood could explain why their presence abruptly ended. Modern scholars treat flood myths as universal allegory, but the Sumerians did not. They wrote about the flood with the precision of eyewitnesses remembering a planetary event, and what they describe is not merely the destruction of cities, it is the extinction of entire categories of intelligent life. The Eridu Genesis, the oldest surviving flood account, states plainly that before the waters rose, the world was populated by more than humans, those who came from the sky, those who rose from the Abzu, those formed of clay. Three distinct origins, three distinct species, coexisting. After the flood, only the ones of clay, humans, remain numerous. This is not symbolic language, it is biological categorization, and the stories become even more specific when cross-referenced with archaeology. In 1929, Sir Leonard Woolley excavated the Royal Cemetery of Ur. As his team dug through layers of cultural debris, they struck something strange. 8 feet of clean, sterile clay, a layer deposited by massive flooding. Beneath it, evidence of an earlier civilization with architecture, pottery, and artifacts, unlike the later Sumerian world. Above it, the fully developed Sumerian city-state. Between the layers, complete discontinuity. Woolley proclaimed he had found the flood. Newspapers sensationalized it. Scholars disputed it. But even the skeptics could not explain the sudden shift in material culture. This wasn't evolution, it was replacement. And the problem deepens. Similar flood layers appear at Kish, Shuruppak, Lagash, and Uruk, but the dates don't match perfectly. Some layers are centuries apart. Some represent enormous regional floods, others catastrophic river migrations. Yet the Sumerian texts describe a singular event. This appears contradictory until we consider the possibility that the flood was not one event, but a series of cascading catastrophes that destroyed coastal and riverine populations across Mesopotamia over centuries. Climate instability between 3500 and 2900 BC is well documented. Sudden sea level rise in the Persian Gulf, violent river shifts, meltwater surges from the Zagros Mountains, and possible tsunami deposits. What if the Sumerians experienced multiple floods, remembered them as one, and, most importantly, recorded them not for what they did to cities, but for what they did to species? Because the Sumerians insist, after the flood, the world lost entire forms of life. The Atrahasis epic says that after the waters receded, the beings who labored, the Igigi, no longer walked the earth. The Epic of Gilgamesh describes Utnapishtim releasing a dove, swallow, and raven, classic flood narrative, but also emphasizes the corpses that covered the world, the extinction of whole orders of life. Other tablets say the ancient teachers, the Apkallu, returned to the Abzu, never to re-emerge. The Sumerian king list shows pre-flood rulers with reigns of thousands of years, marked with the Dingir determinative, non-human kings. After the flood, kings suddenly live normal lengths. No hybrid beings, no shining ones, no fishmen, no winged sages. The species that once ruled vanished. So the central mystery of Sumerian tradition is not simply that a flood occurred, it's that the flood marked the end of a multi-species world. A world where humans were not the only intelligent inhabitants. But what happened to these beings? Why do they vanish simultaneously across texts, art, and archaeology? 3 possibilities arise: extinction, withdrawal, or assimilation. Each has compelling evidence. 1. Extinction through catastrophe. The simplest and darkest explanation: the flood wiped them out. If these species were coastal, aquatic, or valley-dwelling, as Sumerian myths imply, they would be incredibly vulnerable to rising waters, sediment floods, and habitat collapse. Extinction does not require killing every individual, only reducing population below recovery thresholds. Small, isolated populations, like those implied for hybrids and sages, could vanish in one season. 2. Withdrawal to inaccessible regions. Multiple tablets describe beings returning to the places of their origin, sky, sea, mountain, or underground realms. These could be references to submerged civilization sites, mountain regions now eroded or unexplored, or symbolic descriptions of remote homelands. This is reinforced by ritual texts where priests call to the deep but receive no answer, implying silence where once there was contact. 3. Assimilation into humans. This is hinted everywhere. Humans created with divine blood, hybrid offspring, kings claiming descent from gods, and beings like Enkidu representing transitional forms. Over generations, interbreeding could erase distinct species, leaving only humans with residual traits, mythologized as divine descent. But there is a fourth possibility, rarely spoken aloud in archaeology, but impossible to ignore in Sumerian literature. 4. Deliberate erasure. The flood itself is described as intentional. Enlil orders it. The gods approve it. Humans survive only because Enki disobeys. The texts frame it as judgment, culling, or strategic reset. The targets? Not only humans, because the texts make clear humans were new. Rather, the flood appears to target the older species, the pre-flood rulers. This scenario aligns disturbingly well with mythic themes of cosmic conflict. The Igigi rebellion, the wars of earlier gods, the slaying of primordial beings in Enuma Elish. Could the flood represent a decisive blow in an ages-long conflict between competing intelligent species? A purification of the earth, a controlled extinction event? Whatever the truth, the result is the same. The beings depicted in early Sumerian iconography vanish abruptly from the historical record. The sophisticated teachers of astronomy, agriculture, architecture, and kingship cease to appear in texts written after the 2900 BC, and yet the Sumerians preserved their memory with almost obsessive devotion. They carved them into seals. They built temples according to their measurements. They copied star catalogs from a world that no longer existed. They recorded lineages that spanned impossible lifespans. Why preserve these memories so carefully? One damaged tablet from Uruk gives a clue. We searched for the teachers when the waters fell. We called to the sky and to the deep, but none answered, only wind and silence, and so they rebuilt alone. In the next block, we go deeper into the archaeology beneath Sumer's oldest cities, evidence that suggests the earliest layers were not built by humans at all. If the flood was the dividing line between worlds, then the deepest archaeological layers beneath ancient Sumer are the only surviving doorway back into that forgotten era. What lies beneath the cities of Eridu, Uruk, Kish, and Shuruppak has challenged archaeologists for almost a century and continues to defy every clean evolutionary model of civilization. Because the deeper we dig, the older the structures become, but the more advanced some of them seem. This is the paradox at the heart of ancient Mesopotamia, and no site exposes that paradox more brutally than Eridu, the first city, according to the Sumerian king list. It is here, beneath the scorching southern desert, where we find a vertical history of 17 temples stacked one atop another, each built directly above the ruins of its predecessor. A perfect stratigraphic timeline stretching back thousands of years. But the mystery lies at the bottom. The lowest temples, Temple 6, V, 3, 2, and finally Temple 1, sitting directly on virgin soil, date to around 5400 BC, long before the Sumerians were supposed to exist. And yet these earliest structures already show features that should only appear in far later periods. Standardized brick sizes, perfectly aligned foundations, cardinal direction orientation, geometric planning based on ratios used millennia later, and evidence of deliberate formal architectural design. There is no trial phase, no primitive precursors, no slow development. The oldest structures appear fully mature. This is the exact opposite of what archaeologists expect. Normally, early settlements show rough experimentation, shifting layouts, inconsistent building styles. But at Eridu, the earliest known temple is already built with the confidence of a culture that has inherited architectural knowledge rather than developed it, and the foundation deposits deepen the mystery further. Beneath several early temples, archaeologists found caches of objects, ritual offerings sealed away where no human would ever see them again. Among these items were precision-shaped stones, shell ornaments, copper tools far too advanced for 5400 BC, and symbolic carvings matching later Sumerian motifs. Some of the copper implements showed metallurgical sophistication that should not exist until at least 3000 BC. Temperature control, alloy mixing, and metal purity beyond the capabilities of Neolithic villages. In the field notes, rarely discussed publicly, one archaeologist remarked, "It is as though someone else built the earliest temples, and later people merely rebuilt them." This statement, controversial and quietly buried in academic archives, describes exactly what the Sumerians themselves said in their own inscriptions. Their kings repeatedly claimed they were restoring temples according to the ancient plans, rebuilding sanctuaries in the measurements established before the flood, and following the foundations laid by the lords of old. They were not inventing, they were inheriting. But inheriting from whom? To answer this, we must leave Eridu and travel northwest to Uruk, the legendary city of Gilgamesh, and dig into the platform beneath its most iconic structure, the White Temple. The upper level of the White Temple dates to around 3200 BC, but beneath it lies something astonishing. Older foundations made of limestone blocks quarried from over 60 miles away, blocks cut with precision flat surfaces and interlocking joints, blocks that show signs of having been heated to extremely high temperatures, kiln levels that traditional models say shouldn't exist before 3000 BC. But the mystery is not only technological, it's logistical. Transporting multi-ton limestone slabs across 60 miles of marshland, desert, and rivers would require trained labor teams, complex engineering, hauling systems, and centralized authority. Yet archaeologists insist the region at that time was populated by small, scattered villages incapable of such feats. And once again, these earliest foundations are not crude, not experimental. They are precise, deliberate, and coordinated, just like Eridu. Now we go north to Kish, a city the king list explicitly states was the first to receive kingship after the flood. But beneath its flood layer, excavators found anomalies so severe that many archaeologists quietly avoid discussing them. Flint tools dating to 7000 BC in contexts suggesting organized settlement, obsidian blades from regions hundreds of miles away, pottery with firing techniques unknown in later Sumerian culture, and most mysteriously, a foundation stone carved with proto-cuneiform symbols that predate writing by 1,000 years. This stone, one of the most explosive finds in Mesopotamian archaeology, sits largely ignored in museum storage. The symbols resemble the earliest pictographs of Uruk, but appear in a context thousands of years older. If writing truly originated in the late 4th millennium BC, how could these symbols exist beneath flood layers dating far earlier? Taken alone, each anomaly could be dismissed as misinterpretation, contamination, or coincidence. But taken together, across multiple sites, spanning thousands of years of stratigraphy, a pattern emerges. A pattern the Sumerians themselves spelled out in their own texts. They claimed they inherited civilization from beings who lived before them. They claimed their temples were built on pre-existing foundations. They claimed the earliest cities were established by non-human rulers. They claimed the knowledge of geometry, architecture, and astronomy came from the Apkallu, beings who emerged from the sea. Now consider this archaeological fact. The older the layer, the more advanced the knowledge appears relative to its time. This contradicts the expected curve of human development, but it matches perfectly the Sumerian worldview, that the earliest foundations were not human creations, but remnants of a pre-flood world populated by other species. Here lies the core mystery. Were the earliest layers beneath Sumerian cities built by the Sumerians, or by the beings the Sumerians claimed ruled before them? Even conservative archaeologists admit the earliest temple plans show no signs of learning, only continuity, only tradition, only inheritance. And where does that inheritance come from? The Sumerians were clear. The Apkallu, the seven sages, built the first sacred structures, half-human, half-fish beings, amphibious, hybrid, teachers of civilization, myth, or memory. Because the stratigraphy aligns disturbingly well with the mythology, the oldest layers, those closest to the pre-flood era, show architectural sophistication that should not exist for another 2,000 years. Above the flood layers, human construction becomes dominant. Below them, something else was building. And this raises an even deeper question, one so controversial that most mainstream scholars refuse to touch it. What if the earliest layers were constructed by a non-human species that went extinct in the flood? In the next block, we will follow the trail into the star catalogs and astronomical tablets, records the Sumerians explicitly say they copied from beings who lived before the deluge. If architecture hints at an inheritance from a forgotten species, then astronomy exposes it with far greater clarity, because the sky does not lie. Stone can erode, myths can distort, and cities can be buried beneath silt and time, but the stars remain fixed in their cycles. They move with mathematical precision across thousands of years. And if an ancient culture possessed accurate astronomical knowledge far earlier than it should, that knowledge cannot be explained through guesswork, imagination, or coincidence. It must come from observation or inheritance. This is why the Sumerian star records are so troubling. They appear fully formed, not primitive, not experimental, not slowly developed across generations. Instead, the earliest astronomical tablets show complex mathematics, precise tracking of planetary cycles, and a deep conceptual understanding of celestial mechanics, at a time when human civilization was barely emerging. And the Sumerians themselves make it clear. They did not discover this knowledge. They received it. One of the oldest and most important astronomical texts is the Apkallu, a star catalog compiled around 1000 BC, but explicitly described as a copy of far older tablets. The scribes state plainly that they are preserving the measurements of those who came before. And within the text are clues pointing to astronomical observations dating to at least the 3rd millennium BC, perhaps even earlier. For example, the Apkallu describes the Venus cycle with astonishing precision. Modern astronomers have confirmed that its recorded periods match the actual orbit of Venus to within a fraction of a day, an achievement requiring decades of continuous observation and advanced mathematical modeling. Yet there is no evidence that early Sumerian society had the infrastructure for long-term astronomical institutions. No observatory towers, no specialized instruments, no generations of scribes passing down cumulative measurements from father to son. Instead, the tablets state that the knowledge was inherited from pre-flood observers, from the Apkallu, the watchers, the sages, the beings who measured the heavens before humans had learned to write. The Sumerians believed these beings were amphibious, part human and part fish, emerging from the sea to instruct humanity. Artistic depictions show them holding tools resembling surveying rods, measuring cords, and calibrated staffs, objects associated with geometry and celestial alignment. These symbols appear not only in mythological scenes, but in administrative seals, suggesting the Apkallu were considered real contributors to early civilization, not symbolic figures or metaphors. The problem arises when we examine the earliest mathematical tablets. The Sumerians used a base 60 system, unlike the base 10 or base 20 systems used by most early cultures. Base 60 is extremely efficient for calculating celestial cycles because it divides cleanly into multiple factors: 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30. But such a system is unnatural for human psychology. Humans count with fingers and toes. We default to 10s and 20s. Base 60 requires abstract conceptualization and is vastly more complex. Yet it appears in the archaeological record fully developed, with no simpler predecessor. It is as if someone gave the Sumerians a complete mathematical system, optimized not for daily life, but for astronomy. Why would a primitive society invent such a sophisticated system out of nowhere? And why does it match so perfectly the needs of astronomical prediction? Some scholars have attempted to explain this by suggesting merchant accounting systems evolved into astronomy over centuries. But this theory collapses under scrutiny. The earliest uses of base 60 already involve sophisticated geometric and astronomical applications. There is no evidence of gradual development. The system enters history as a completed framework. Once again, we see the pattern repeated: inheritance without invention. The alignment of temples reinforces this. Across Sumer, major religious structures are aligned to solstice risings and settings with astonishing accuracy, often within less than a degree. Achieving this requires advanced observational tools and long-term sky tracking. It also requires a deep understanding of horizon geometry and seasonal variation. But according to conventional timelines, such precision should not exist in the 4th millennium BC, and yet it does. Some scholars have argued that these alignments could be achieved by simple observation with the naked eye. But this argument fails when examining the precession of the equinoxes, a slow wobble in Earth's axis that shifts the position of stars by tiny increments over thousands of years. Precession was not officially discovered until the 2nd century BC by the Greek astronomer Hipparchus. But several Sumerian myths appear to describe the shifting of the zodiac through ages that align with the mathematical pattern of precession. The Epic of Gilgamesh, for example, speaks of 12 cosmic ages associated with constellations in reverse order, mirroring the direction of precessional drift. This implies awareness of cycles lasting over 2,000 years each, cycles that cannot be mapped without records stretching across multiple millennia or advanced predictive modeling, which humans at that time simply did not possess, unless they inherited the models. This is why the ancient texts are so explicit. They credit the pre-flood sages with establishing the stations of stars, dividing the sky, marking the paths of planets, and setting down the measurements humanity continued to use. One tablet found in the ruins of Nippur states, "The watchers measured the heavens before the flood and gave their knowledge to the scribes who came after." Another describes Enki as possessing a tablet of destinies, a mythological artifact on which the paths of stars were written. Though symbolic, the concept hints at preserved astronomical records older than human civilization itself. Now consider this. If the Sumerians inherited their mathematics, their astronomy, and their architectural principles from beings who existed before the flood, then the pre-flood world must have had a level of organization and intelligence far beyond what we attribute to early humans. A world where multiple intelligent species coexisted, each with specialized roles, where advanced knowledge flowed from these species to humans in a structured, deliberate manner. In the Sumerian worldview, humanity was not the first. Humanity was the successor, and the evidence increasingly supports this narrative. Because when we combine the astronomical data with the deep architectural layers, the pattern becomes unavoidable. The earliest knowledge appears the most advanced relative to its time. The later knowledge appears derivative, copied, and sometimes misunderstood. The Sumerians knew this. Their scribes confessed it. Their kings boasted of restoring ancient plans, not creating new ones. If their astronomy came from beings who lived before the flood, then those beings had a mastery of the sky far superior to that of early human civilizations. The question becomes unavoidable now. If these beings measured the heavens, where did they go? The answer lies in the next block, where the star records meet the flood myths. and the disappearance of entire species begins to make sense through the lens of catastrophe, extinction, and deliberate withdrawal. If the heavens preserve the memory of those who measured them, the earth preserves the memory of those who built upon it. And beneath the cities of Sumer lie layers that speak not of simple human development, but of interruption, of worlds ending abruptly and beginning anew with knowledge carried forward from an older age. Archaeologists uncover these layers like pages of a book whose authors changed mid-sentence. The Sumerians knew this discontinuity. They wrote about it. They lived on its ruins, and they feared the memory of what had come before. Because between the world of the teachers and the world of humans stands a single event, repeated in every Sumerian tradition with an insistence that borders on obsession: the flood. Not a metaphor, not a symbolic purification, a real and devastating catastrophe described with geological precision. Modern scholars often treat the Sumerian flood as mythological, but the archaeological record complicates the matter. In the 1920s, Sir Leonard Woolley excavated the Royal Cemetery of Ur and struck a layer of clean, water-laid clay nearly 8 feet thick, evidence of a massive flood event that had covered the city and buried an earlier civilization beneath it. Above the clay lay recognizable Sumerian remains. Below it lay artifacts of a different culture, less understood and older than the world we associate with Sumer. But the real problem came when other cities were excavated. Shuruppak, Kish, Uruk, Lagash, each revealed flood layers, but they did not match in age. They were offset by centuries. They were regional, not global. And yet the Sumerian texts speak with one voice. The flood destroyed an entire era. It was the dividing line between two worlds, the world before and the world after. Why would they describe a regional disaster as a global reset? Why insist that multiple species vanished when only local human settlements were affected? Why speak as though a biological and civilizational extinction had occurred? Because to them, something far greater than human populations was lost. The pre-flood world, according to Sumerian texts, was populated by multiple intelligent species. Humans, yes, but also the laboring Igigi, the amphibious Apkallu who taught the arts of civilization, the radiant Anunnaki who served as rulers before kingship passed to humans, and hybrid beings whose forms appear on cylinder seals and temple reliefs. These beings vanish abruptly from the record after the flood layers we excavate today. It is as if the layers themselves, those thick walls of clay, mark not just sediment but disappearance. The Eridu Genesis, the oldest surviving flood account, describes it plainly. Before the flood, there were many kinds. After the flood, only the people of clay remained numerous. People of clay, humans. But who, then, were the others? Cylinder seals depict bird-headed beings performing rituals humans cannot. Fishmen emerging from the sea at dawn, winged figures holding measuring cords, scaled humanoids blessing trees of life. These are not symbolic figures. They appear with anatomical precision, consistent across 2,000 years of art. And yet after the flood strata, they disappear entirely. The silence of the archaeological record mirrors the silence of the tablets. Why would a civilization invent a multiform ecosystem of intelligent beings only to abruptly abandon them in its mythology after a catastrophic flood? Why would their depictions remain consistent for millennia only to stop all at once, unless the flood represented a real biological cutoff? But while some scholars attribute the flood myths to natural disasters along the Tigris and Euphrates, the Sumerians themselves insist the flood was not natural. It was intentional. It was an act of judgment, a decision by the divine assembly to erase a world deemed too loud, too complex, too filled with beings whose purposes conflicted. Violence surrounds the pre-flood world in their texts. The Igigi rebel against their labor. The Anunnaki hold assemblies debating humanity's creation. In some fragments, pre-flood kings wage wars over regions now lost. In the Atrahasis epic, the gods themselves admit they cannot control the world they have shaped. Their solution is not negotiation or reform, it is annihilation. But the most telling detail appears in artistic remains. In the oldest layers of Mesopotamian cities, beneath the flood strata, archaeologists find architecture whose techniques do not match later Sumerian styles. Brickwork laid at unusual angles, irrigation systems of unexpected sophistication, foundation stones carved with symbols resembling proto-writing older than cuneiform, metallurgical techniques appearing thousands of years before their time. These anomalies diminish after the flood layers. What comes afterward is Sumerian, consistent, understandable, traceable. What comes before is something else entirely. It is as if the flood did not simply destroy cities. It erased a species, or several. The Sumerians hint at this when they describe the transfer of kingship. Before the flood, rulers reigned for thousands of years, and their names appear with the divine determinative, the dingir, marking them as skyborn. After the flood, kings reign for decades, and the determinative disappears. No winged beings appear in administrative seals. No hybrid forms serve in court scenes. The Apkallu no longer emerge from the sea to teach. They are spoken of in the past tense. Something ended, something vanished, and humans rebuilt on top of their foundations. But the question that haunted the Sumerians and continues to trouble us today is this: did these beings die in the flood, or did they leave? The texts offer both possibilities. Some describe extinction, bodies carried by the floodwaters. Others describe withdrawal, beings returning to the sky, descending into the depths, disappearing into the mountains. Still others describe hybridization, a merging of species that eventually diluted the non-human forms into humanity, leaving only traces of extraordinary bloodlines remembered in myths of divine ancestry. Archaeology cannot confirm any of this. It can only reveal the patterns the Sumerians noticed, an advanced world whose deepest layers show knowledge inherited, not learned, followed by a catastrophic interruption, and then by a simpler human world rebuilding with fragments of what was lost. If humans inherited civilization, astronomy, and architecture from a world destroyed by the flood, then our story as a species begins not with invention, but with survival. We did not rise through brilliance alone. We rose because others fell, or perhaps because others chose to step away. What vanished from the world when the floodwaters receded? And why did the Sumerians speak of the silence afterward with such grief, as though the loss was not just physical, but cosmic? The answers begin to shift in the next block, where we examine the disappearance of non-human species through the lens of extinction, assimilation, and deliberate erasure, and how the Sumerians preserved their memory through symbols, myths, and the architecture they inherited. If the flood marked the fracture between two worlds, then the centuries that followed became a long act of searching, humans combing through the ruins of a vanished order, trying to understand who had lived beside them, who had taught them, and why those beings no longer walked the earth. The Sumerians did not treat the disappearance of these older species as a mythic abstraction. They treated it as a historical wound. Their tablets read like testimonies left behind by the last witnesses of a world now irretrievable. The first question they asked was the simplest. Did these beings die? Extinction is the most straightforward explanation, and in many ways the archaeological evidence supports it. Species can vanish without leaving skeletons. Floodwaters deposit silt that dissolves bone. Structures collapse. Sediment compresses. 1,000 years pass. What remains? Fragments, tools, a foundation stone buried beneath clay, a carved hybrid figure carefully placed in a ritual deposit long after its makers disappeared. The Sumerians speak often of bodies carried away, of waters covering the mountains, of creatures unable to breathe the bitter wind after the deluge. The Eridugenesis mourns the multitudes who no longer rose with the dawn. The Epic of Gilgamesh describes a landscape after the flood so saturated with death that even the scavengers found no place to land. These details suggest a catastrophe so complete that even resilient species could not recover. But if extinction explains their absence, it does not explain why the Sumerians continued to honor these beings with precision. Why preserve their anatomical forms? Why maintain their measurements? Why carve their images with such loyalty if they were simply dead and gone? The second explanation is withdrawal, the idea that these beings left before the flood, sensing its arrival or choosing to distance themselves from humans. In Akkadian traditions, the Apkallu return to the Apsu after completing their work. They vanish into the depths, leaving humanity to continue the project of civilization. The Igigi, exhausted from labor, return to the heavens after humans are created as their replacements. Other texts describe beings ascending to their star homes or retreating to distant mountains where no human walks. This language carries a tone of resignation, not catastrophe. It suggests intentional separation. If these beings possessed advanced knowledge of celestial cycles, geological rhythms, or environmental instability, they might have departed before disaster struck, leaving only memory and architecture behind. But if they left, where did they go? And why did they never return? The Sumerians do not answer directly. They only say, "The watchers withdrew, the heavens no longer spoke." The third possibility is assimilation. If multiple intelligent species coexisted with early humans, interbreeding might have blurred the boundaries between them. Over generations, hybrid lineages could have absorbed the non-human populations until their distinct traits became diluted. The Sumerians hint at this repeatedly. Creation myths describe humans formed from a mixture of divine essence and earthly clay. Kings claim descent from Anunnaki blood. Priesthoods perform rituals that promise to rekindle the spark of the first ones. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, Enkidu embodies this ambiguity. He is not fully human, not fully divine. He belongs to both worlds and neither. His strength exceeds that of mortals, yet he dies like a man. His existence suggests that hybrid forms could live among humans while slowly losing the traits that once set them apart. Over time, these lineages might become indistinguishable from ordinary humanity, leaving behind legends that exaggerate their origins but obscure their integrated reality. If assimilation took place, then the diversity of the pre-flood world did not disappear. It was absorbed. The Sumerians, in this interpretation, did not merely inherit knowledge, they inherited bloodlines. Human civilization may be built on a biological mosaic that preserves faint echoes of beings who guided early societies. But the fourth possibility is the darkest: deliberate erasure. In this scenario, the flood was not an environmental event, but a targeted reset, a decision made by one species to eliminate others. The texts hint at conflict among the divine assembly before the flood. The Igigi rebel from labor. The Anunnaki debate the fate of humanity. Some beings oppose the coming destruction, while others insist on it. The flood then becomes not a natural tragedy, but a strategic culling. In this light, the disappearance of non-human species becomes not an accident, but an outcome. A world with multiple intelligent species might face conflicts over resources, territory, authority, or ideology. If one species wielded enough power to trigger a planet-altering event, or foresaw that nature would trigger it, it could allow or initiate the destruction of its rivals. The Sumerians record this possibility obliquely. They describe the post-flood world as cleansed, made quiet, established for the children of clay. One text says, "The many forms that once lived are no more. The world is set in order for the new." This phrasing implies intentionality. Someone benefited from the new status quo. Someone remained while others vanished. But even if erasure occurred, it was not total. Something survived. Something was preserved, not physically but culturally. The Sumerians inherited measurements, star catalogs, building principles, and cosmological frameworks too advanced for their era. They inherited memories that did not belong to them. They rebuilt temples, according to ancient plans, and oriented their cities by the star paths set before the waters. This suggests that knowledge alone was not erased. It was carried forward deliberately by humans who remembered their teachers and by humans who regretted their disappearance. The Sumerians became custodians of a forgotten world, rebuilding on the bones of a civilization that preceded them. And this brings us to a deeper question. If the beings who measured the heavens and built the earliest structures left behind knowledge for humans, did they intend for us to eventually rediscover who they were? Or were their remnants meant to fade into symbolic mythology, safe from direct interpretation? Because as archaeology continues to expose the layers beneath ancient cities, the oldest foundation levels do not resemble human learning curves. They resemble inherited mastery. They display knowledge that appears fully formed, not developed. They bear the imprint of hands that understood geometry, astronomy, hydrology, and engineering before human societies reached the complexity needed to invent such systems. If humans inherited not only tools and techniques but a world shaped by other species, then our early history is not a story of invention but of continuation, of taking up a mantle left behind by those who vanished. In the next block, we explore these earliest foundations directly, the anomalous architecture beneath Sumerian cities that challenges conventional chronology and hints at a civilization older than any written record, one that may hold the final clues to who came before the flood. If the Sumerians became the heirs of a world shattered by catastrophe, the clearest evidence of that inheritance lies not in their myths, but beneath their feet. The oldest architectural layers of Mesopotamian cities behave like time capsules sealed before the dawn of what we would call civilization. They do not show the expected progression from crude structures to refined ones. They do not reveal a learning curve. Instead, they begin at a level of precision that should not exist at the presumed start of human urban development. Eridu, the city the Sumerians called the first place where kingship descended from heaven, stands at the center of this mystery. Archaeologists excavating its temple complex uncovered not one structure, but a vertical sequence of 17 temples, each built directly atop the ruins of its predecessor. The deeper the excavation went, the stranger the findings became. The upper layers reflected recognizable Sumerian style, everything consistent with early dynastic building practices. But as excavators reached the lowest levels, the architecture changed. Different brick ratios, foreign orientation angles, foundation trenching unlike anything in known Sumerian construction. These earliest structures, dating back to around 5400 BC, appear suddenly. There are no transitional forms, no experimental layouts, no evidence of gradual planning. The first temple is already aligned to cardinal directions, already proportioned according to geometric principles that the Sumerians would preserve for thousands of years. It appears as though the builders were following established design instructions rather than inventing anything. One archaeologist described these earliest temples as arriving fully formed, a phrase that clearly troubled him, because such appearance contradicts the evolutionary model of architecture that academia expects. Then there are the foundation deposits. Beneath several early temples, excavators uncovered small hidden caches, shell beads, shaped stones, metallurgical objects, some of which should not exist in their assigned era. Among them were copper tools with alloy compositions requiring temperature control far beyond what the 5th millennium BC should permit, according to conventional timelines. These implements resemble later craftsmanship, but they appear thousands of years earlier, buried deliberately beneath temples as if they were relics from an older age the Sumerians themselves revered. Why would a civilization bury tools they supposedly did not yet have the technology to produce? Uruk presents an equally unsettling puzzle. Beneath its famous White Temple, archaeologists found foundation stones shaped with cutting techniques that left marks inconsistent with copper or bronze tools. Some stones appear hardened through sustained exposure to heat levels that should only be possible with advanced kiln systems, and yet these foundational layers predate the emergence of such technologies. More perplexing, the stone itself originates from quarries nearly 60 miles away, requiring logistics and transport capacity that exceed what scattered villages of that era could achieve. The lowest building phase at Uruk suggests not the beginning of a city, but the rebuilding of a much older one. At Kish, the contradictions deepen. Below the flood layers that signify the post-catastrophe world, excavators uncovered artifacts that simply do not belong to the expected timeline. Obsidian blades indicating long-distance trade networks thousands of years before such networks appear elsewhere. Pottery with firing profiles unknown in the region, and most strikingly, a limestone block carved with proto-symbols resembling pre-cuneiform writing, yet predating the invention of writing by more than a millennium. The block sits in a museum, cataloged but unexplained, a silent witness to a period that archaeology cannot categorize. Across these sites, one consistent theme emerges. Sumerian civilization did not arise from nothing. It arose atop something older, something sophisticated, something that left behind only the bones of its architecture and fragments of its knowledge. Sumerian inscriptions confirm this in ways modern scholars prefer to treat figuratively. Temple restoration texts frequently state that a building was rebuilt according to ancient measurements or following the foundations laid before the flood. King Ur-Nammu wrote that he restored a temple in the original plan set by the lords of old. The lords of old, who were they? The Sumerians do not describe them as humans. They describe them as the shining beings, the sages, the ancestral gods whose reign ended when the waters rose. If the earliest architectural layers of Sumerian cities preserve techniques too advanced for their assigned era, then the builders must have either inherited these techniques or rediscovered them. Yet the layers show no signs of rediscovery. No mistakes, no corrections, no variability. They demonstrate perfect continuity, as if the knowledge was preserved intact from a source older than the flood. This raises an unavoidable question. How much of Sumerian civilization was truly Sumerian, and how much was adopted from a pre-flood world whose inhabitants vanished? Consider the standardized brick sizes that appear suddenly in the earliest known layers. For standardized production to emerge, a sophisticated administrative or ritual structure must exist. Yet the archaeological context of this earliest period shows no evidence of dense population centers capable of coordinating such standardization. The simplest explanation is that these standards were inherited. The same applies to temple orientation. Aligning buildings precisely with solstice sunrises or stellar positions requires sophisticated observational astronomy. Yet the earliest Sumerian astronomical tablets appear fully formed, with no primitive versions preceding them. This mirrors the architectural phenomena, systems arriving complete rather than developing incrementally. If humans did not construct the first temples at Eridu, Uruk, and Kish, then who did? Were these structures built by the beings the Sumerians describe, the Apkallu, the overseers, the sages of the deep? If so, these beings were not mythological projections, but actual participants in the earliest phases of civilization, leaving behind buildings whose design philosophies persisted long after their disappearance. The Sumerians repeatedly insist that they rebuilt cities on older ruins and inherited measurements set before the waters. They speak of pre-flood rulers whose lives spanned thousands of years and who governed according to celestial plans. They record the existence of instructors who emerged from the sea each dawn to teach the arts of agriculture, architecture, and astronomy. If these beings existed, then Sumer was not the birthplace of civilization, but the cradle of its rebirth, the point where survivors, human or otherwise, reconstructed a world shattered by cataclysm. But what if the inheritance went deeper than architecture? What if the knowledge preserved in Sumerian temples and star catalogs reflects not mere memory but direct instruction, teachings passed from non-human species to humans rebuilding in their wake? In the next block, we turn to the astronomical evidence, the star tables, the celestial orientations, and the mathematical systems that appear not as human inventions, but as the preserved data of an older world, recorded by beings the Sumerians, remembered as those who measured the heavens before humanity even existed. If the deepest layers of Sumerian cities whisper of an inheritance older than humanity, the stars shout it. Nowhere is the rupture between conventional archaeology and Sumerian testimony more visible than in their astronomical records, documents so advanced, so mathematically precise, that they should belong to a civilization thousands of years later, not one at the dawn of recorded history. Astronomy is not a discipline that appears suddenly. It requires generational continuity, uninterrupted observations, and precise record-keeping. To track celestial cycles accurately, a society must watch the sky for centuries, sometimes millennia. Yet the earliest Sumerian astronomical tablets already contain fully formed systems, as if the sky had been charted long before the Sumerians ever looked upward. The Mul-Apin tablets, legendary among historians of science, are perfect examples. Compiled around 1000 BC but explicitly copied from earlier sources, they read less like the early attempts of a developing civilization and more like a compressed encyclopedia of an older world star science. The texts detail constellations, heliacal risings, planetary movements, and even eclipse calculations. Modern astronomers have tested these observations and found they match real celestial patterns with shocking accuracy. The Venus cycle, recorded by the Sumerians, tracks planetary behavior so precisely that the margin of error is mere days, over spans of years. This level of accuracy requires two things: advanced mathematics and long-term observation. The Sumerians had both from their earliest recorded periods. But here is the puzzle. There is no transitional mathematics in their historical layers. Their base 60 system appears fully functional, perfectly adapted for dividing circles, measuring angles, and tracking time. It is not a system a culture invents step by step. It is a system a culture receives. Sumerian scribes freely admitted this. Over and over again, they wrote that their celestial knowledge came from those who measured before the flood, or the watchers of heaven, or the seven who knew the courses of the stars. We translate these terms as metaphors, but the Sumerians did not. They treated these beings as predecessors, actual entities who observed the sky long before humanity existed in its present form. One tablet from Nippur states that the stations of the stars were fixed in ancient times by the sages who descended from the Apsu. The Apsu, the primeval deep, was not a poetic metaphor for the Sumerians. It was a place of origin, a realm from which their earliest teachers emerged. Another text attributes the first mapping of the sky to those who came down in the days before kingship, an era the king list marks as the time when non-human rulers governed the world. The astronomical orientation of Sumerian temples only deepens the mystery. Temples built more than 5,000 years ago align with solstice sunrises and lunar standstill points with near mathematical perfection. These alignments are not approximate. They require sustained observation of celestial mechanics. Yet the earliest temples, those beneath the flood layers, already show this precision. Again, no learning curve, no experimentation, just knowledge implemented flawlessly. The ziggurat of Eridu aligns with the winter solstice sunrise. The White Temple of Uruk aligns with the summer solstice sunset. Several Sumerian cities follow a grid pattern oriented to celestial markers rather than to local geography. This suggests a cultural inheritance of astronomical planning, not a discovery of it. But perhaps the most unsettling evidence lies in the Sumerians' knowledge of the Great Year, the precessional cycle of Earth's wobbling axis, a phenomenon taking roughly 26,000 years to complete. Modern astronomy identified axial precession in the 2nd century BC. Yet Sumerian myths describe a sequence of world ages that match the progression of constellations through the heavens, exactly what precession causes. The Epic of Gilgamesh references cosmic ages dominated by different constellations shifting in reverse order, just as precession dictates. If the Sumerians recognized this slow stellar drift, then someone charted the heavens for far longer than Sumerian civilization existed. Did the Sumerians extrapolate the full cycle mathematically, or did they inherit long-term records from a culture erased by the flood? Their texts suggest the second. The Epic of Era calls astronomy the secret knowledge of the Apkallu, stating they established the heavenly writing before the floods and wrote the courses of the stars for the generations to come. It explicitly claims that pre-flood beings charted the heavens, and that post-flood humans copied these charts. This is not poetic language. It is historical memory, replicated in administrative texts, temple hymns, and astronomical tables. Cylinder seals reinforce these claims. Many show human scribes receiving measuring rods, ropes, and stylized star charts from non-human figures. Bird-headed beings, fish-bodied sages, winged humanoids. These scenes are not symbolic. They portray the transfer of technical knowledge. The measuring rods and ropes depicted are the same tools used to calculate angles and align buildings to celestial markers. One seal from the Akkadian period shows a fish-bodied being pointing a calibrated staff toward a star symbol, an unambiguous image of an Apkallu teaching stellar measurement. Why would a culture invent mythic creatures to teach astronomy when they could simply depict human astronomers? Unless those creatures were remembered as the original astronomers, what emerges is a consistent picture. The Sumerians did not merely observe the sky. They inherited a celestial system, mathematical, structural, and symbolic, from beings they remembered as older, wiser, and non-human. If this is true, then Sumerian astronomy is the surviving fragment of a scientific tradition belonging to a species wiped out or withdrawn after the flood. A species whose star knowledge was so advanced that humanity would spend thousands of years relearning it. In the next block, we confront the most controversial implication of this. If these beings existed, if the Sumerians truly coexisted with multiple intelligent species, then where did those species go? Did they die, leave, or merge with us so completely that only myths and measurements remain? If the Sumerians inherited star maps from an earlier world, then the next question becomes inevitable. What happened to the species who first drew those maps? Their disappearance is so total, so absolute, that it raises suspicions even before the tablets explain it. Because while archaeology gives us ruins, climate anomalies, and sudden cultural resets, the Sumerian texts give us something far more precise: a before and an after. A world filled with many intelligent beings, and a world filled with one. The flood is always the dividing line. Every Mesopotamian tradition, Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian, Assyrian, agrees that before the flood, the world was populated by multiple categories of beings, each with different origins and roles. Humans were not alone, nor central. After the flood, humans stand alone by default. The question the tablets never stop circling is, was this natural or deliberate? The Sumerian king list is one of the first clues. It records rulers from before the flood with lifespans of tens of thousands of years, many marked with the divine determinative symbol Dingir, indicating beings not born on earth. These rulers governed cities the Sumerians claimed they themselves did not build. But after the flood line, after the single phrase, "Then the flood swept over," those rulers vanish entirely. Kingship returns, but it returns to humans. The non-human rulers disappear from the narrative as if wiped away. The Epic of Gilgamesh strengthens the divide. The flood survivor, Utnapishtim, tells Gilgamesh that the gods decided to end the first world because it had become noisy. Scholars usually interpret this as mythic allegory for overpopulation. But the older Sumerian versions imply something else. The noise referred not only to human disturbance, but to conflict among the beings who populated the pre-flood world. A fragmented tradition from Nippur describes the three kinds who walked the earth, those from the sky, those from the deep, and those shaped from clay, being unable to coexist peacefully. This hints at something modern scholars tend to avoid: the possibility that the flood myths preserve memory of interspecies conflict. The Sumerians describe multiple intelligent species, each with distinct bodies, lifespans, and environments. Some thrived in water, some in mountains, some in cities that predated human settlement. Conflict, territorial, ecological, or political, would have been inevitable. So when the tablets say the gods voted to destroy the world, is that symbolic language for a natural disaster? Or did one group choose to end the world of the others? The archaeological record is uncomfortably consistent with sudden depopulation. Across southern Mesopotamia, the flood layers represent real destruction events around 2900–2700 BC. Beneath these layers, traces of older cultures, anomalous architecture, non-standard construction techniques. Above them, the Sumerians proper, with uniform city designs, writing systems, and political structures. In other words, a reset. But extinction doesn't require a global apocalypse. It requires demographic collapse. If the pre-flood species were already few in number, specialized, localized, non-redundant in their environments, a single catastrophic flood season could have wiped them out. A species adapted for deep-water living might survive the initial flood, but die off when the waters receded. A species requiring high-altitude refugees might be isolated and erased by climate change. A species with low birth rates could be eliminated by a single failed generation. The myths reflect this fragility. The Apkallu, the fish-bodied sages, simply returned to the Apsu and did not appear again. The shining ones ascended to the high places. The bird-headed beings flew to the realms beyond wind and sight. Some disappear through death, some through exile, some through a kind of dimensional withdrawal the Sumerians did not attempt to rationalize. But another explanation exists, one the tablets whisper but rarely state: assimilation. Hybridization is everywhere in Mesopotamian mythology. Humans created from clay, mixed with divine blood, the sons of heaven taking human wives, the birth of giants with mixed traits. Even the heroic Enkidu, created by the gods to balance Gilgamesh, has an ambiguous nature, part animal, part human, part divine essence. If multiple intelligent species coexisted in close contact, interbreeding may not have been symbolic at all. Over many generations, hybrid populations could absorb small non-human lineages into larger human ones. In such a scenario, the original species would disappear, but fragments of them would persist inside humanity itself, not in fossils, not in architecture, but in traits, instincts, cultural memory, or capacities the Sumerians attributed to divine bloodlines. In later periods, Sumerian kings claimed descent from gods not because it granted political legitimacy, but because it implied biological inheritance from non-human ancestors. Some priesthoods required pure blood of Anu, suggesting an attempt to preserve pockets of hybrid lineage. These practices make more sense if the Sumerians truly believed they carried remnants of older species within them. Yet the starkest possibility remains: deliberate erasure. If the beings who ruled before the flood did not leave willingly and did not die accidentally, then someone or something may have orchestrated their removal. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, describes violent battles among divine factions, ending in the defeat and dismemberment of older beings. Marduk slays Tiamat, an ancient primordial entity, and creates the world from her body. This is not creation from nothing, it is creation from conquest. A younger species overthrowing an older one, erasing its presence, and reshaping the world in its own image. What if the flood narrative is another version of this pattern? A younger species, threatened by older ones, triggering or weaponizing a catastrophic flood to wipe out competitors. Humans would not have needed to do this. They were too weak then. But a younger supernatural faction, one closer to humans, more aligned with them, might have done so. In this reading, humans were not just survivors of the flood, they were beneficiaries. So what truly happened? Did the older species perish, depart, blend into humanity? Was the flood natural or engineered? The Sumerians never fully say, but they leave something behind. Grief. A sense of loss permeates their literature, a constant mourning for the great ones who walked the earth before us. Even kings of the later dynasties describe themselves as children of a diminished world. Whatever the truth, the Sumerians saw themselves as the inheritors of a broken lineage, a lineage that once included beings whose memory we preserve only through surviving clay tablets, half-erased carvings, and star maps older than humanity. In the next block, we explore the deepest archaeological question of all. Did humans truly build the first Sumerian cities, or did they inherit them from extinct species whose fingerprints remain buried in foundations older than history itself? If we accept even the possibility that Sumerian cities were inherited rather than invented, then the next mystery becomes almost unavoidable. What lies beneath the first cities of Mesopotamia? The deeper archaeologists dig, the stranger the layers become. Because instead of finding the expected progression from crude huts to simple shrines to organized settlements, they find the opposite. At the very bottom, where human civilization is supposed to be at its most primitive, they encounter structures that should not exist. Eridu is the first example. According to the Sumerians, Eridu wasn't just the oldest city, it was the place where kingship descended from heaven for the very first time. When excavators reached the top layers, they found exactly what they expected: standard Sumerian temples from around 2500 BC. But as they dug deeper, passing through layer after layer of earlier temples, a disturbing pattern emerged. Each temple was built directly atop the ruins of a previous one, forming a vertical timeline descending thousands of years. But when they reached the lowest layers, far beneath any recorded history, they found architecture dating to around 5400 BC, centuries before the Sumerians were supposed to exist. Yet the oldest temples were not primitive. They were aligned to cardinal directions, built with standardized brick proportions, and designed with sacred geometry the Sumerians themselves would later use. It was as if the builders of the earliest structures already possessed the architectural sophistication of later urban periods. There is no developmental curve, no learning process, no experimentation. The first attempt is already perfect. This does not happen in human history without predecessors. Under one of the earliest temples, archaeologists found an inexplicable copper object, crafted with metallurgical precision that shouldn't appear for another 2,000 years. The implication is uncomfortable. The Sumerians did not innovate these techniques. They inherited them. Uruk, believed to be the world's first real metropolis, deepens the anomaly. Beneath the famous White Temple, excavators discovered limestone blocks weighing several tons, quarried from over 60 miles away. There's no sign of the tools required to carve them, no wheel marks indicating transport, no evidence of the infrastructure needed to move massive stones across desert terrain. Worse, the lowest foundations show cut marks inconsistent with copper or bronze tools, marks more aligned with harder materials the archaeological record has never acknowledged for this era. The builders of these foundations did not match the technological profile of the earliest known humans. At Kish, the story grows even stranger. Tools appear in layers dated to 7,000 BC, long before human settlement is believed to have reached southern Mesopotamia. Pottery fragments beneath the flood layers display firing temperatures and decorative patterns that belong to no known culture. One limestone foundation block is carved with symbols resembling proto-cuneiform, yet predating writing by 1,000 years. Scholars cataloged it, photographed it, and quietly moved on. Some discoveries are too anomalous to fit. Across all these sites, the pattern is unmistakable. Below the earliest Sumerian architecture lie structures that follow standardized measurements, use construction methods inconsistent with known human capabilities, appear suddenly without evolutionary predecessors, and often match descriptions of pre-flood cities in Sumerian texts. This suggests something extraordinary. Sumerian civilization may be a reconstruction of something older. The Sumerians themselves said exactly this. Foundation cylinders from multiple cities use the same phrasing, restored according to the ancient plan, rebuilt on foundations laid before the waters, and constructed in the measurements of the old ones. These aren't metaphors. They are technical statements, describing architectural plans inherited from an earlier age. A Babylonian inscription from King Esarhaddon states, "I rebuilt the temple according to the ground plan from before the flood, drawn by the sages of old." Who were these sages? Why were their measurements preserved? And how did those measurements survive a civilization-ending catastrophe? The tablets consistently answer, the Apkallu. The Apkallu, those mysterious amphibious sages described as half human, half fish, were said to have designed the earliest temples, taught irrigation, astronomy, mathematics, and blessed the first kings. After the flood, they vanished, but their instructions remained, written down, hidden beneath temple foundations, waiting for humanity to rediscover them. But what were the Apkallu? Were they symbolic representations of knowledge, or were they literal beings whose physical forms the Sumerians preserved in carvings? Their depictions across 2,000 years show extraordinary consistency. Fish-bodied sages emerging from the sea, bird-headed beings holding measuring rods and surveyors' ropes, winged humanoids guarding entrances, always proportionally larger than humans. Scholars often call them composite beings, mythological hybrids, yet the anatomical accuracy across millennia suggests more than symbolism. Muscle structure, wing articulation, scale patterns, every detail is rendered with biological precision. No society maintains such consistent depictions of imaginary creatures across 2,000 years unless something anchored those images in memory. But what makes the question truly unsettling is not the existence of these forms. It's their disappearance. Every Sumerian text agrees. The flood ended their age. Before the flood, they walked among humans. After the flood, they are never seen again. Their cities, if they built them, were buried beneath silt and rebuilt by humans who lived in their shadows. Their knowledge survived, but only partially, imperfectly, like photocopies of a lost original. Think of what this means. When archaeologists dig into the earliest layers of Sumerian cities, they might not be uncovering the birth of civilization. They might be digging into the ruins of a civilization erased, one the Sumerians remembered only through whispers, legends, and inherited plans they could not fully understand. The deeper we dig, the older the mystery becomes. If humans did not build the first temples, if they inherited mathematics and star maps, if they rebuilt cities following instructions from vanished species, then our entire understanding of the origins of civilization collapses. The next block pushes the question to its breaking point. What do the astronomical tablets, the oldest star records in human history, reveal about the species who came before us? If the architectural evidence suggests inheritance, and the mythological evidence suggests coexistence, then the astronomical evidence forces us to confront a possibility almost too large to articulate. The Sumerians were not the first to study the sky. They were continuing a system established by beings who lived before the flood. Ancient astronomy is not intuitive. It's not something a civilization stumbles into accidentally. To map the heavens with real precision, you need long-term observations, centuries-long records of star movement, planetary cycles, eclipses, equinoxes, and seasonal drift. You need mathematics. You need instruments. You need the awareness that the sky even can be measured in consistent patterns. Yet the earliest Sumerian star catalogs already demonstrate knowledge that should require thousands of years to develop. The Emul Apin tablets, the oldest known systematic star atlas, appear fully formed. They include lists of constellations, heliacal rising and setting dates, corrections for seasonal drift, lunar eclipse predictions, and the complete 8-year cycle of Venus. All of this appears in a culture supposedly just learning how to write. But this knowledge didn't begin with Sumer. The tablets explicitly say they are preserving the measurements of those who came before the flood. The scribes describe themselves not as astronomers, but as copyists, preserving ancient tables of celestial motion that were already old when Babylon rose. On one tablet from Nippur, the scribe wrote, "We record the stars as the ancient ones measured them." The phrase, ancient ones, is the same term used for the Apkallu, the pre-flood sages. Another text refers to those who established the stations of heaven before kingship descended, before kingship, before civilization, before humanity as a political species. According to the Sumerians, astronomy did not originate with them, it was inherited. Even the mathematics betrays this inheritance. The Sumerian choice of base 60 isn't arbitrary, it's not intuitive. No known culture naturally counts in 60s, and yet base 60 is mathematically perfect for astronomical calculation. It divides evenly into almost everything. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, 30. It is the system you choose if your primary goal is to map the sky. But here is the strange part. Base 60 appears in Sumer fully mature. There is no earlier stage, no developmental progression, no primitive counting systems beneath it. The first time it appears in the archaeological record, it's already optimized. Just like Sumerian writing, just like Sumerian architecture, just like Sumerian law. The Sumerians themselves explained this sudden appearance with a single phrase: "We were taught." Who taught them? The tablets answer, the Apkallu. The Apkallu, those mysterious half-fish, half-human sages, are repeatedly credited with bringing astronomical knowledge from the Apsu, the deep ocean beneath the earth. One hymn describes them as those who measured the vault of heaven and set the paths of the wandering stars. The wandering stars are planets, a distinction the Sumerians understood thousands of years before the Greeks separated planets from fixed stars. Cylinder seals show Apkallu holding what look remarkably like measuring rods, not weapons, not ceremonial items, tools. Tools for surveying, for calculation, for establishing alignments, for marking the heavens on the earth. One seal shows a fishman pointing toward a star symbol while holding a notched staff, an object archaeologists believe might be an early astronomical sighting instrument. Another shows a bird-headed figure raising a pine cone-shaped tool toward a stylized tree of life symbol, a scene scholars often interpret as ritual, but which in context resembles measurement, aligning natural cycles with celestial patterns. Then there is the problem of precession. The Earth wobbles on its axis, causing the stars to drift slowly over a 26,000-year cycle. This phenomenon, axial precession, is nearly impossible to detect without centuries of recorded observations. Modern astronomy didn't identify precession until the 2nd century BC. But Sumerian texts appear to encode knowledge of cosmic ages, 12 distinct eras linked to constellations, shifting in reverse order through the sky. That reverse order is the defining signature of axial precession. How would a civilization just emerging from the Neolithic know this? Either they inherited observational records spanning thousands of years, or they inherited the results of someone else's observations. The Sumerians said exactly this. One astronomical text claims, "The watchers calculated the ages before the flood and wrote their numbers on tablets of lapis, lapis lazuli, stone that survives where clay does not." Stone tablets the Apkallu supposedly carried from the Apsu before the waters came. Those tablets, if they ever existed, are lost, but fragments of the system remain embedded in later cuneiform copies. Even temple orientation shows impossible precision. Early Sumerian temples aligned to solstices and cardinal directions, within a margin of error of less than 1 degree, something normally achievable only with advanced instruments or inherited knowledge. The first ziggurats appear with alignments perfect enough to detect seasonal drift across centuries. Meanwhile, other early cultures required millennia to achieve similar precision. The Sumerians began at the finish line. The deeper we look, the more troubling the question becomes. If the Sumerians inherited their star knowledge, who or what was here before them to observe the sky for thousands of years? The Apkallu are the traditional answer, but the Sumerians describe different types of beings before the flood. The Apkallu, waterborne sages; the Igigi, skyborne laborers; the Anunnaki, radiant rulers. 3 categories of non-human intelligence, 3 origins: sea, sky, and earth. The Sumerians described these origins literally, not symbolically. They believed the Apkallu emerged from the ocean depths. They believed the Igigi descended from the sky. They believed the Anunnaki came from the shining place, which scholars translate as heavens, though the Sumerians used the same word for the celestial dome above. To dismiss all of this as mythology is easy, but mythology changes across centuries. Their depictions did not. The anatomical precision does not drift. The roles do not change. The meaning does not fade. These beings are always described with functional tasks, specific knowledge, measurable contributions, and detailed physical forms. But after the flood, complete silence. Why? Where did they go? If they survived, why did they never return? If they perished, why did humanity inherit their knowledge but not their bodies? The Sumerians gave one answer: they returned to their places. Another answer says, the flood took them. A third says, their blood became mixed with ours. 3 explanations, none complete. But all of them agree on one essential truth. Before humans ruled the world, other intelligent beings lived here, and the Sumerians remembered them. In the next block, we face the darkest question of all. Did the flood erase an entire ecosystem of intelligent species, leaving humans as the only survivors? If the flood marks the dividing line between a world of many intelligent species and a world ruled solely by humans, then the most disturbing question becomes unavoidable. What exactly was destroyed? The Sumerians didn't describe mythic beings fading into symbolic legends. They described literal species, distinct, physical, biological, vanishing suddenly after a cataclysm so violent that entire cities were buried beneath layers of water-laid clay. Every Mesopotamian text repeats the same message. Before the flood, the world was shared. After the flood, it was emptied. The Eridu Genesis is blunt. Before the deluge, Earth was home to humans, yes, but also the Apkallu, the Igigi, and the pre-flood kings, whose lifespans stretched across tens of thousands of years. These beings interacted, taught, ruled, organized cities. They're portrayed in administrative documents, civic inscriptions, temple hymns, engineering instructions, not just mythic literature. Then comes the flood. One world ends, another begins, and in the post-flood world, only humans remain. If this is symbolic, it is unusually precise. If it's literal, then what the Sumerians remembered is nothing less than a mass extinction event. Modern archaeology has long dismissed the flood as allegory, but multiple excavations tell a different story. In cities like Shuruppak, Kish, and Uruk, archaeologists uncovered thick layers of pure flood sediment. These aren't the thin deposits left by seasonal river overflow. They are massive, abrupt, violent layers, meters of silt and clay laid down by catastrophic, city-destroying water. In Leonard Woolley's team found an 8-foot layer of sterile clay. Beneath it, an entire earlier culture. Above it, Sumerian civilization, a clean break. But the unsettling part is this. the flood layers at different cities don't match in date. One around 2900 BC, another closer to 2700 BC, another even earlier. Not one single flood. Multiple catastrophic floods striking different regions of southern Mesopotamia within a narrow window of centuries. A cluster of disasters, enough to destroy interconnected populations. A natural cycle of devastation? Possibly. A coordinated eradication? The texts seem to suggest so. In the Atrahasis epic, the gods do not simply allow a flood, they vote for it, deliberately, purposefully, as a reset, as a culling. And the language describing the beings who disappear after the flood is clinical, not metaphorical. They are removed from the earth. They no longer appear. They returned not to their places. Their seed was ended. This is biological, not symbolic. So what were these beings? The Apkallu, for one, are always described with the same anatomy, part human, part fish, amphibious, emerging from oceans or deep waters. Their role? Teachers, engineers, astronomers. The Igigi, by contrast, are almost always associated with the sky, winged, luminous, capable of descending and ascending. They labor in the heavens, according to the texts, until they rebel and are replaced by humans. The pre-flood kings, described in the Sumerian king list, ruled for tens of thousands of years, lifespans beyond human biology. Their reigns end suddenly with the flood. And then there are the hybrid figures carved into cylinder seals and palace walls, bird-headed humanoids, serpent-scaled beings, giant anthropomorphic creatures with elongated skulls, forms depicted consistently across 2,000 years. Archaeology typically dismisses these as symbolic, but symbols evolve. Artistic style changes. Iconography shifts. Yet the anatomy of these beings remains stable across millennia. It's as if these weren't artistic inventions, but remembered forms. If these beings existed physically, then what happened to them? Three major scenarios emerge. 1. Extinction. A flood sweeping through lowland Mesopotamia would annihilate amphibious populations living along rivers or coastlines. It would drown burrows, disrupt breeding cycles, collapse ecosystems. A species already small in number could vanish in a single generation. The Sumerians emphasize this repeatedly. After the flood, they appeared no more. 2. Withdrawal. Some texts suggest survival, but in exile. They returned to the deep. They ascended to the heavens. They fled to their original places. This implies departure rather than death. But if their homelands were coastal or highland regions later submerged or destroyed, their disappearance from the archaeological record becomes unsurprising. 3. Assimilation. Perhaps the most unsettling possibility, the beings did not vanish. They merged. Interbreeding appears throughout pre-flood narratives. Hybrids appear in multiple traditions. If repeated across generations, the distinct traits of non-human species could have diluted into expanding human populations, leaving only faint genetic traces. A post-flood world dominated by humans could have been the result not just of survival, but absorption. But then a fourth possibility looms, the one the Sumerians feared most. 4. Erasure. The flood is portrayed as an intentional act, a purging, a cleansing, a deliberate destruction not of cities, but of rival species. The surviving texts even hint at conflicts before the flood, wars between the Igigi and the Anunnaki, rebellions, uprisings, punishments. A world of competing intelligent species would inevitably experience tension over land, resources, reproduction, and power. What if the flood was not merely divine punishment, but the final move in an ancient conflict, a reset engineered to remove all but one species, humanity? Impossible? Perhaps. But the Sumerians recorded it as history, not mythology, and the archaeological record, though incomplete, does not contradict them. Beneath the oldest cities lie layers that don't fit human developmental patterns, tools too advanced for their period, architectural precision without a learning curve, foundations suggesting knowledge inherited from predecessors who no longer exist. The silence after the flood is deafening. Before, the tablets speak of angels, sages, giants, radiant beings, creatures of water and sky. After, there is only humanity, bewildered, rebuilding, remembering, and mourning. One damaged fragment from Nippur reads, "When the waters withdrew, we sought the ones who taught us, but none remained. Only their wisdom stayed, their wisdom, but not their bodies, their knowledge, but not their presence, their measurements, but not their voices." The final question rises like a shadow behind all others. Did humanity rise because others fell? Did we inherit a world emptied for us? In the next block, we descend into the deepest layers of Sumerian cities, Eridu, Uruk, and Kish, where the oldest structures hint at builders even older than civilization itself. To understand what the Sumerians meant when they said, "We rebuilt according to ancient plans," we must go deeper, not metaphorically, but literally, into the ground beneath their oldest cities, because hidden below the structures we can see, below the layers we can easily date, lie foundations that should not exist. Foundations too old, too advanced, too precise, too intentional to fit the known developmental trajectory of early human civilization. And nowhere is this more unsettling than in Eridu, considered by the Sumerians themselves to be the first city, not the first human city, but the first center of kingship lowered from heaven. Eridu should be a primitive settlement, a cluster of huts, a basic village with simple mud brick constructions. Instead, it is a vertical archive of architectural evolution that moves in the wrong direction. Archaeologists uncovered 17 sequential temples stacked on top of one another, each built directly atop the ruins of the previous. The uppermost belonged to recognizable Sumerian culture, but as excavators dug deeper, the structures grew older and stranger. By the time they reached Temple 16th, 17th, and beyond, dating to around 5400 BC, they encountered precision, alignment, and construction choices far more advanced than what should exist at the dawn of settled life. The earliest temple, Temple I, sits directly on untouched soil, meaning the builders were the first to construct anything there, and yet they built with orientation toward celestial points, with brick ratios that match later Sumerian standards, with measurements that seem inherited rather than invented. There is no experimental phase, no primitive prototypes, no evidence of trial and error development. It is as if the first builders of Eridu already knew exactly what they were doing. Archaeologists have long struggled to explain this. Some attribute it to cultural diffusion, a vague term suggesting knowledge drifted in from elsewhere. But where? There are no older cultures nearby displaying such architectural sophistication. Nothing in neighboring regions explains the sudden appearance of standardized brick ratios, sacred geometric proportions, and cardinal alignments. Other explanations fall even flatter: coincidence, instinctive alignment, or natural preference for symmetrical layouts. These do not account for the mathematical precision embedded in Eridu's earliest layers. One early field report included an unusually candid line: "It is as though the builders inherited a plan." Inheritance, knowledge passed down from an unknown source, a blueprint older than the culture that rebuilt atop it. At Uruk, the pattern becomes even more dramatic. Beneath the famous White Temple, dating to around 3200 BC, older foundations were discovered, composed of massive limestone blocks cut with a precision inconsistent with the copper and stone tools supposedly available at the time. These blocks were quarried from sites more than 60 miles away, requiring logistical and organizational capabilities well beyond those of early villagers. Some stones bore scorch marks, evidence of high-temperature firing or surface-hardening technologies. But the temperatures required exceed what archaeologists believe existed in that era. Most troubling, The foundational stones at Uruk fit together with minimal mortar, fashioned with exact geometric angles. This is not crude work. This is advanced construction, and yet these are the oldest layers. It is as if Uruk was not built from scratch, but rebuilt atop a far older platform constructed using techniques the Sumerians themselves did not originally invent. Their own texts confirm it. Restored according to the plan from before the waters, rebuilt in the measurements of the ancients, laid upon the foundations established long ago. In Kish, the lies beneath the flood layer are even more troubling. Excavators found tools and ceramics from cultures that should not exist in southern Mesopotamia, obsidian blades from distant regions, flint tools dated to 7000 BC, and pottery styles that match no known local group. But the most shocking object found beneath the flood layer was a limestone foundation block carved with symbols resembling proto-cuneiform, long predating the invention of writing by over 1,000 years. Scholars listed it, photographed it, placed it in a museum, and quietly moved on because it did not fit any existing model. It is easier to ignore anomalies than to rewrite history. Even more puzzling, beneath flood layers across Mesopotamia, several sites show traces of irrigation networks, levees, and water management systems significantly more advanced than the earliest known Sumerian settlement patterns. These include multi-mile canal systems, engineered water channels, controlled levee structures, early agricultural grids, all in layers dated thousands of years earlier than expected. This should be impossible. And yet the Sumerians explained it plainly. The 7 sages taught us our measures. And who were the 7 sages? The Apkallu, amphibious hybrid beings depicted with fish bodies and human torsos, always associated with teaching architecture, city planning, agriculture, and astronomy, always linked to pre-flood civilization, always shown emerging from water and returning to it. If these beings are symbolic, then why do their symbols match the archaeological anomalies so precisely? At Shurupak, beneath the flood destruction layer associated with the final generations before the deluge, deeper foundations appear to follow architectural principles different from later Sumerian methods. Angles and bonding patterns more advanced than one expects from early settlements. Large-scale irrigation infrastructure present without any sign of the developmental phases that should precede it. This is not evolution, this is inheritance. And the silence beneath the flood layers, the sparse, scattered artifact record, reveals another uncomfortable truth. Something existed before, but whatever it was, its remains do not resemble typical human settlement patterns. The Sumerians knew this. They wrote about it openly. They called the pre-flood world the era of many beings, and the post-flood world the age of humans alone. So what are we looking at in the archaeological record? Not the birth of civilization, but the handover of civilization. The first builders of Mesopotamia may not have been human at all. The earliest foundations appear too sophisticated, too consistent, too uniform across distant regions to belong to scattered tribes. The Sumerians admitted as much. They did not invent civilization. They inherited it, and beneath still unexcavated layers may lie the ruins of those who came before, the ones erased by flood, by time, or by deliberate act. If we are inheritors rather than originators, then the question becomes, who built the world that humans found waiting beneath their feet? In the next block, we turn to the astronomical knowledge encoded in early cuneiform tablets, knowledge so precise, so mathematically advanced, that even modern scholars cannot explain how it emerged fully formed at humanity's dawn. If the architecture beneath Sumer's cities hints at inheritance from a forgotten world, the astronomy recorded on their tablets makes that inheritance undeniable. Because while anyone can build walls and canals, it takes something far more advanced to map the heavens, and the Sumerians mapped them with a precision that should have been impossible for a civilization supposedly just emerging from prehistory. Astronomy is not guesswork. It requires consistent observations across centuries, mathematical frameworks, abstract reasoning, and an understanding of geometric relationships that usually develop only after long scientific traditions. And yet the earliest Sumerian records, the ones closest to the dawn of writing, already contain measurements, star catalogs, and celestial predictions that rival the calculations of much later civilizations. This is the core mystery. Sumerian astronomy appears fully formed. No primitive stage, no gradual progression, no record of discovery, only preservation. Consider the Mulapin tablets, written around 1000 BC but explicitly copied from much older sources. These documents list the heliacal rising of major stars, the setting times of constellations, the movement patterns of every visible planet, mathematical cycles of Venus, formulas for eclipse prediction, tables correlating lunar phases with seasonal shifts. This is not basic sky watching. This is astronomy at a high scientific level, requiring centuries of prior data. But the Sumerians insist they did not create this knowledge. They wrote that they were simply copying the measurements of the ancients, not guessing, not experimenting, copying. In other words, they inherited a celestial system already calculated long before their civilization began. Modern astronomers reviewing Apkallu discovered something troubling. The Venus cycle recorded in Sumerian tables is accurate to within a fraction of a percent over many years. That kind of precision demands continuous record-keeping across long spans, far longer than the earliest known Sumerian observation windows. Where could such records have come from? The tablets themselves provide the answer. They repeatedly refer to those who measured before the flood, not metaphorical beings, not priestly poetical flourishes, beings with a distinct category marker, non-human. The Sumerians called them the Uana, the sky watchers, the ones who set the divisions of the heavens. They are depicted on cylinder seals, not as humans with tools, but as hybrid beings, fish-bodied, bird-headed, winged, holding measuring rods and celestial instruments. If these beings were symbolic, why would the Sumerians bother carving such advanced, anatomically unrealistic forms with careful detail? Why not depict humans? Why not show priests observing the sky? Instead, the oldest depictions of astronomical measurement show non-human figures performing tasks requiring advanced understanding, and they appear consistently for over 2,000 years. Even more remarkable is the Sumerian base 60 mathematics, still used today to measure time and angles. This system is shockingly sophisticated for its era. It divides the circle perfectly. It simplifies fractional calculations. It allows complex ratios across astronomical cycles. But base 60 is not intuitive. No culture defaults to it naturally. Human counting evolves from bodies, 5 fingers, 10 fingers, 20 digits. Base 10 or base 20 systems dominate ancient civilizations, yet the Sumerians start directly with 60, fully implemented, no simpler systems beneath it, no early counting tablets showing progression. Why would humans invent such an unnatural system unless they were taught it for a specific purpose? A purpose like tracking celestial movements. Again, the texts give credit. The sages from before the flood taught us the measures of the heavens. Whether literal or metaphorical, the meaning is unmistakable. This knowledge was received, not developed. More evidence emerges from temple alignments. Sumerian ziggurats and sacred structures consistently align with solstice and equinox points, often to within 1 degree. To do this, you must observe stellar drift over long periods, or you must already know the patterns. But the most explosive puzzle involves precession, the slow wobble of Earth's axis over a 26,000-year cycle. Precession is nearly imperceptible within a human lifetime. It was officially discovered by Greek astronomers around 150 BC. Yet Sumerian mythology includes a sequence of 12 ages, each connected to a zodiac constellation, shifting in the same direction as precessional movement. And the Sumerian king lists connect political eras to these cosmic ages. Coincidence or inherited memory? Even more compelling is the language found on tablets in Ashurbanipal's library, citing far older sources. The sages measured the heavens before the flood destroyed their dwellings, and we record what remains of their measurements. Again, the tablets do not describe discovery. They describe transcription, an attempt to preserve ancient data from a vanished world. To understand how advanced this inheritance might have been, consider their ability to predict lunar eclipses. Eclipses require enormous predictive frameworks involving lunar nodes, Saros cycles, and complex timekeeping. Yet Sumerian tablets include eclipse warnings, calculations, and omen lists based on precise, repeatable mathematical patterns. Where did this come from? The standard academic explanation is early observation, but early observation without inherited frameworks cannot calculate Saros cycles. That takes centuries of continuous data. Another fragment states, they established the stations of the wandering stars in days before the kingship descended. Wandering stars refers to planets. Their movements require decades of tracking, yet when writing appears, that knowledge is already stabilized. Cuneiform star charts even include stars visible only during particular epochs, suggesting they were originally recorded thousands of years before the tablets we possess. This implies either 1. Long-term records kept by a civilization predating the Sumerians. 2. Mathematical models inherited from an extinct culture. 3. Direct teaching from beings described in myth. 4. A combination of all three, but perhaps the greatest puzzle is the Tablet of Destinies, described as containing the paths of the stars written in times before time. Mythologically, it is held by gods. Practically, it may refer to a physical object, a pre-flood astronomical compendium, now lost. The Sumerians believed they were not discovering the sky, but recovering it, reconstructing what was lost, reassembling fragments of a system once whole, a system older than them, and possibly older than humanity itself. And if the architecture beneath their cities and the astronomy in their tablets are both inherited, then we must ask the forbidden question: what civilization existed before the Sumerians? Who taught them? And why did that civilization vanish? In the next block, we turn to the king lists, hybrid beings, and pre-flood rulers whose lifespans defy biology and whose disappearance marks the sharpest boundary in ancient history. If the Sumerians truly inherited the heavens, then the next inheritance they preserved is far stranger. The memory of rulers who lived before time was counted, before writing was invented, before humanity became the sole intelligence shaping the world. This memory survives in a single text that has confounded scholars for more than a century: the Sumerian king list. On the surface, it appears to be a simple chronological record of kings and dynasties, but the deeper one reads, the more the document abandons historical convention and enters a realm where myth and memory converge. The list opens with a statement so bold that historians usually dismiss it as poetic metaphor. When kingship descended from heaven, kingship was in Eridu, not was created, not emerged naturally. It descended, bestowed from above. Whether heaven refers to a physical realm, a mythical domain, or the dwelling place of non-human teachers, the implication is the same. Rulership did not begin with humans. It was a transferred institution, delivered intact, complete, functioning. Then the list becomes even more unsettling. The earliest rulers are not human kings as we understand them. They reign for periods entirely incompatible with human biology. One reigns for 28,800 years, another for 36,000, another for 43,200. These numbers follow a mathematical pattern, suggesting they are not exaggerations invented for storytelling, but encoded durations based on a timekeeping system older than the Sumerians themselves, perhaps inherited from the same beings the texts credit with establishing the divisions of the heavens. The Sumerians distinguished these pre-flood rulers with a symbol placed before their names, the dingir, marking divinity or non-human origin. The same symbol appears above hybrid beings, sages from the deep, sky-born teachers, and figures with wings or scales. In the king list, this symbol is not decorative. It is categorical, a marker of species, not status. After the flood, this symbol disappears from human kings. The transition is abrupt. Something ended. Something vanished. If these early rulers were fictional, we would expect them to follow mythic structures, like heroes from other ancient cultures whose tales evolve across centuries. Instead, the list treats them with bureaucratic precision. Names, cities, lengths of rule, and succession lines recorded as if they were historical administrations. The Sumerians did not separate myth from administration. To them, these ancient beings were not metaphors. They were predecessors. Archaeology deepens the puzzle. Beneath known Sumerian cities lie earlier layers that do not match the civilization above them. Eridu's earliest temple levels, buried beneath 6 millennia of reconstruction, show architectural planning and standardized measurements inconsistent with Neolithic villages. These foundations appear to follow an established template, as if they were built according to instructions that had already existed. The king lists claim that Eridu was the first city gains weight when one examines these earliest layers, not primitive huts, but organized structures aligned with astronomical points. Uruk follows the same pattern. Beneath its massive white temple lie foundations shaped with precision tools not yet invented at the time they were supposedly constructed. Kish reveals pottery and symbols predating writing by 1,000 years. Everywhere archaeologists dig deep enough, they encounter the same phenomenon. The oldest layers are the most anomalous. They do not show invention. They show inheritance, an earlier world partially preserved and partially erased. This is exactly what the king list describes. 2 eras separated by catastrophe, before and after the flood. And the beings who ruled before the flood differ not just in lifespan but in nature. Their depictions across cylinder seals are consistent. Tall, luminous figures, hybrid forms, beings with wings or feathers or scaled skin, creatures emerging from the sea, bird-headed teachers holding measuring rods. The Sumerians did not invent these forms and gradually refine them. The artwork shows no evolution. It is stable for 2,000 years. Then suddenly, these beings vanish. The king list marks the boundary starkly. After listing 8 or 10 antediluvian rulers with impossible reigns, it declares simply, the flood swept over. Everything before this line belongs to a different world. Everything after belongs to ours. From this point forward, reign lengths fall from tens of thousands of years to hundreds, then to decades. The Dingir symbol disappears. The hybrid beings no longer walk among kings. The world becomes human. This abrupt shift has no parallel in any other ancient record. Egyptian dynasties transition gradually. Chinese chronicles evolve through overlapping eras, but the Sumerian king list contains a wall, a total break, as if the scribes were describing 2 species, 2 civilizations, 2 ecosystems separated by extinction. The flood myths support this interpretation. They do not describe rainstorms or river overflows, but species-level annihilation. The Eridu Genesis explicitly states that after the flood, only those made of clay remained numerous. The others, those from the sky, those from the sea, those of shining form, were gone. Whether they perished, departed, or assimilated, the result is the same. The world after the flood had only one intelligent species left to rebuild. But perhaps the most compelling evidence that the Sumerians viewed pre-flood rulers as literal beings lies in how they describe the rebuilding process. Repeatedly, kings claim to restore temples according to the measurement of old, using plans set before the waters. These phrases suggest the Sumerians believed they were not founding civilization. They were restoring it. They were following instructions left behind by the beings who ruled before them. If these beings existed, what were they? Were they earlier branches of hominid evolution? Survivors of an advanced civilization lost to climate catastrophe? Visitors from coastal regions now submerged? Or a species so different from humans that ancient scribes could only describe them using hybrid imagery? Whatever they were, the Sumerians believed they were real. They believed these beings measured the heavens, established kingship, built temples, taught civilization, and vanished in a single catastrophic moment. And they believed the world after the flood was only a shadow of the world that came before, a world they inherited but did not create. In the final block, we confront the question that pulses beneath every Sumerian tablet, every sealed foundation layer, every hybrid carving, every astronomical table. If humans were not the first, then what happened to the others? And why does their absence feel intentional? The question lingers like a pulse beneath the ruins of Sumer. What happened to the beings who shaped the earliest cities, measured the heavens, established kingship, and walked in forms that no longer exist in our world? Their disappearance is too abrupt to ignore, too complete to dismiss, and too consistently documented to be accidental. The Sumerians remembered them with precision, not in poems or legends alone, but in administrative texts, temple inscriptions, astronomical manuals, and king lists carved with the seriousness reserved for fact rather than fable. Yet after the flood layers, after the sediment resets the world, after 2900 BC, their presence dissolves. They are gone. Humanity stands alone. The silence is profound. It is the silence that follows extinction, abandonment, or erasure. It is the silence carved into the tablets by scribes who lived in the shadow of a memory they could not fully explain. They inherited cities whose foundations were older than their people. They inherited astronomical knowledge already perfected. They inherited measurements credited to sages who no longer walked the earth. The Sumerians saw themselves as heirs to a world whose original builders had vanished, leaving behind only fragments of their existence. Those fragments form the puzzle modern scholars still struggle to piece together. Across Mesopotamia, from Eridu to Uruk, from Kish to Lagash, the pattern repeats. The earliest architectural layers show sophistication beyond what early human populations should possess, as if the builders were following a template laid down long before recorded history. Foundations cut with precision tools not yet invented, alignments matching celestial events calculated with mathematics supposedly far beyond the abilities of emerging agrarian communities. Standardized measurements appearing fully formed in the oldest levels, preserved for thousands of years with reverence that borders on ritual obligation. These are not the hallmarks of invention. They are the fingerprints of inheritance. The flood marks the divide. What came before it belongs to another world. What came after belongs to ours. The Sumerians understood this. Their king list preserves it bluntly. Before the flood, rulers reigned for tens of thousands of years. After the flood, reigns shrink to decades. Before the flood, kings bore the dingir symbol of skyborn origin. After the flood, no human name bears it again. Before the flood, hybrid beings appear in scenes of teaching, measuring, ruling. After the flood, they fade into memory, depicted only in ritual contexts or as guardians carved on temple walls. The Sumerians did not erase them from their mythology. They recorded them as beings who once existed and then disappeared. Why did they disappear? 3 explanations stand at the forefront. Extinction through climate and cataclysm remains a possibility. The Sumerian flood narratives describe not a local disaster, but the end of a multi-species ecosystem. The geological instability of the region, the shifting rivers, the rising sea levels of the Persian Gulf, and the evidence of repeated catastrophic flooding could have annihilated populations already fragile and isolated. If these beings depended on habitats particularly vulnerable to environmental collapse, a sudden series of floods might have done more than damage cities. It might have erased entire species. Another possibility is withdrawal. Many texts portray these beings not as victims, but as entities capable of leaving deliberately. Some return to the sea, others ascend to the mountains or sky. Some simply vanish into their places of origin. To the Sumerians, this was not metaphor, but literal departure. Perhaps these beings retreated to regions no longer accessible or visible to us. Ancient coastlines now lie hundreds of feet beneath the waves of the Persian Gulf. Mountain fortresses could crumble without leaving recognizable remains. Whatever their destination, the texts consistently frame the post-flood world as a place they no longer inhabited. Assimilation offers a third explanation. The Sumerians believed humans were hybrid creations, born of clay mixed with divine blood. If interbreeding occurred, then the distinct species that once ruled could have dissolved into humanity itself, their traits diluted across generations, their knowledge preserved imperfectly, their uniqueness absorbed into a growing population of humans. In this scenario, the rulers before the flood did not vanish. They became us. Their lifespans shortened, their bodies changed, their identity blurred into a dominant species that no longer recognized its own mixed origins. But beneath these possibilities lies a fourth, darker interpretation, one whispered in the structure of the myths rather than spoken directly. The flood is described not as accident, but intention, a culling, a judgment, a reset. If multiple intelligent species once shared the Mesopotamian plain, conflict might have been inevitable. Competition for land, water, resources, or other forms of power could have escalated into catastrophic confrontation. The flood myth could preserve the memory of a decisive event orchestrated not by nature, but by rival powers. The disappearance of pre-flood beings may not have been an organic outcome. It may have been engineered. Whatever happened, the Sumerians lived in the aftermath of a world they regarded as diminished. They wrote with reverence about the time when sages emerged from the sea each day, when shining beings instructed human craftsmen, when rulers walked with the radiance of stars, when humans were not alone. Their texts hold a nostalgia for a world lost, a world richer in forms of life, a world where knowledge flowed from sources no longer present. Their sorrow is subtle but unmistakable. The world after the flood is a shadow of the world before it. Perhaps the most haunting detail lies in the way the Sumerians framed their own achievements. They never claimed to invent civilization. They claimed to restore it. They rebuilt temples according to plans older than themselves. They observed the sky using calculations inherited from forgotten teachers. They carved hybrid beings not as symbols of imagination, but as portraits of memory, everything fundamental to their culture: kingship, astronomy, architecture, mathematics, ritual, they attributed to those who came before. If humanity were not the first intelligent species to shape cities and measure the heavens, then our civilization stands on the buried foundations of another. Those foundations still exist, deep beneath Mesopotamia, beneath flood layers, beneath the ruins of temples rebuilt dozens of times, beneath the silence of millennia. The beings who shaped that earlier world may be gone, but the Sumerians ensured we would not forget them. They preserved their memory in clay that refuses to die. And perhaps that is why these tablets still speak to us. They whisper that human history is not a straight line beginning with us. It is a continuation, a recovery, a remembering. The Sumerians tried to preserve what remained of a world erased by catastrophe, a world populated by species that vanished or departed, leaving humans to inherit a lonely earth. Their message survives across time. We are not the first. We are simply the first who remained. The sands still shift over Eridu. The wind still carries dust from temples whose foundations were laid before writing, before memory, before humans stood alone. Somewhere beneath those layers lies the answer to the question the Sumerians asked in their final lines. What existed before us? Who taught the first builders? And why does the world feel as though someone once lived here and then left? Perhaps one day we will uncover the truth the Sumerians preserved. Until then, their tablets remain the oldest testimony we possess, echoing one final possibility. Humanity inherited a world shaped by others, and somewhere in the forgotten layers of time lies the memory of the beings who came before, and the reason they are gone.